The hiss of the utility press was a 3-beat rhythm, the heavy clank of the iron jaw dropping, the long wet scream of steam, and then the dry metallic sigh as the vacuum pedal pulled the moisture down into the concrete floor. Chloe stood at the front counter of Hans Prestige Cleaners, her thumbs rhythmically sliding along the plastic edge of a black wire hanger. The shop smelled of perchloroethylene, a sweet, chemically heavy scent that clung to the back of the throat like cold grease, mingled with the burnt starch odor of 300 cotton shirts. It was 6:15 p.m. Outside, the autumn rain was turning the gray suburban street into a slick mirror, reflecting the flickering neon of the liquor store across the avenue. Her mother, Unji, was 10 feet away, sorting a mountain of damp, gray-tinted industrial towels. She did not look up when the bell above the door chimed, nor did she look at Chloe. Instead, her fingers worked with a frantic, twitching speed, snapping the towels flat and tossing them into a yellow plastic bin. Minji, Unji said, using Chloe's Korean name without pausing her hands. The man from the city came back while you were at your class. He left another white paper. It's on the microwave. Chloe did not move immediately. She finished sliding a heavy wool coat into its protective plastic sheath, her fingers burning slightly where a rough staple on the cardboard collar protector had scraped her knuckle. A tiny, bead-sized drop of blood appeared on her skin. She did not wipe it. She watched it sit there, bright and perfect against her pale flesh, before she finally pressed it into the seam of her jeans. "Did he say anything?" Chloe asked. Her voice was quiet, pitched low enough to sit beneath the roar of the dry-cleaning machine in the back room. "How should I know what he said?" Unji's tone was flat, stripped of any curiosity, loaded only with a quiet resentment of someone who had spent 22 years navigating a city by its shapes and colors rather than its words. He had the blue folder, the same one as last month. He pointed at the back sink. I told him no, owner not here. I told him to wait for you. Unji threw a particularly heavy towel into the bin. It landed with a wet, dull thud. "You need to call them," her mother added, her eyes still fixed on the gray cotton. "Tell them we already paid the environmental fee in January. Tell them they made a mistake. Your father says the city is just trying to squeeze money out of small businesses because the mayor is corrupt." Chloe walked behind the partition to the tiny break area. The microwave, a grease-filmed white box from 1998, sat on top of a low filing cabinet. Beside it lay a folded piece of white paper, damp at the corner where her father's mug of instant barley tea had left a ring. She picked it up. It was not a routine fee notice. It was a formal citation of non-compliance from the County Department of Environmental Health. It stated that the primary dry cleaning unit, an aging multi-solvent machine her father had bought second-hand in 2012, was venting emissions that exceeded the permissible limits of perchloroethylene. Failure to provide proof of professional remediation within 7 business days will result in an immediate suspension of operating licenses and a civil penalty of $5,000. 7 days. The letter was dated 4 days ago. Behind her, the heavy plastic curtain to the back room parted. Jin Woo, her father, stepped out. He was 58, but his shoulders curved forward in a permanent hunch, a physical mold shaped by 30 years of leaning over 30-pound steam irons. His white t-shirt was yellowed at the collar and damp with sweat. He did not look at Chloe's face. His eyes went straight to the white paper in her hand. "What does it say?" he asked in Korean, his voice raspy from the lint-filled air. He picked up his mug of barley tea, took a loud, wet sip, and set it back down on the filing cabinet, precisely on the damp ring. Chloe looked at the text on her phone screen, which had lit up in her pocket. "Julian." Just parked outside the bistro. Table is under my name. Don't rush, but I hope you can make it by 7:15. I ordered that white wine you liked last time." She had not seen Julian in 6 days. He had spent the week preparing for his firm's partner review, and she had spent it translating 3 years of past tax returns for her parents' small business administration loan application. An application that had ultimately been denied because Jinwoo had refused to disclose a cash-only laundry contract with a local motel. She looked back at the citation. If she told her father the truth, that the machine was leaking toxic fumes, that they needed to hire a licensed technician immediately, and that they faced a $5,000 fine, the air in the shop would instantly turn radioactive. Her father would begin his familiar, rhythmic pacing. He would accuse the city inspector of being racist. He would ask Chloe why she hadn't explained the maintenance logs to the inspector when he visited last month. He would shout that her college tuition was paid for by the very machine they were trying to shut down. Then her mother would begin to cry quietly into the laundry bins, murmuring about how they should have stayed in Incheon, how their lives were nothing but shame and dirt in this country, all while looking at Chloe with eyes that asked, "Why aren't you fixing this?" The energy required to survive that storm would take hours. She would miss the dinner with Julian. She would spend the night sitting at the kitchen table, draft translating letters to the county, trying to find a loophole in environmental regulations she didn't understand, while her father smoked cigarettes on the fire escape, and her mother cleaned the kitchen cabinets for the 3rd time that week. Chloe did not have the energy. Her body felt heavy, like wet wool left at the bottom of a washer. "It's just a reminder for the annual registration," Chloe said. Her voice was steady, empty of vibration. Her father stopped, his mug halfway to his mouth. "Registration? We paid that." "They had a system error," Chloe lied, her eyes never leaving the green ink stamp on the letter. "They didn't record the payment. I'll send them an email tonight with the receipt from January. It's fine." Jinwoo let out a short, nasal grunt. "Stupid bureaucrats. They don't know how to do real work, always making mistakes and making us pay for it." He turned back toward the steam press, his posture relaxing into its usual heavy slump. "Make sure you do it tonight. I don't want them coming back here when you're not around. I don't like the way that white guy looks at the machines." "I'll handle it," Chloe said. She folded the citation twice, crisp and tight, and slid it into the outer pocket of her canvas bag. She could feel the sharp edge of the paper resting against her hip through the fabric. "Minji," her mother called from the front counter, her fingers now working on a tangled knot of blue plastic tags. "The dry cleaner delivery van is making a weird sound when it reverses, like a squeaking belt. Call the mechanic. Tell him we need him to come look at it tomorrow morning before we start the route." Chloe stood in the dim light of the break room, the smell of burnt starch thick in her lungs. She looked down at her phone screen again. The light from the glass illuminated the small red smear of blood on her thumb. She did not reply to her mother. She didn't say yes, and she didn't say no. She simply walked to the coat rack, pulled her damp trench coat over her shoulders, and began to button it, starting from the bottom up. The driver's side door of the 2008 Honda Civic closed with a hollow, tinny rattle that Chloe felt in her teeth. Inside, the air was instantly cold and damp. The car smelled of old upholstery, stale French fries from a road trip 3 months ago, and the faint, permanent ghost of dry cleaning fluid that seemed to have transferred from her clothes directly into the foam of the driver's seat. She did not turn the key in the ignition right away. She sat in the darkness of the driver's seat, her hands resting on the steering wheel. The vinyl of the wheel was cold and peeling at the top, exposing the rough gray foam underneath. When she gripped it, tiny flecks of black plastic stuck to her palms like ash. She turned the key. The engine caught with a wet, struggling whine before settling into a rough, vibrating idle that made the dashboard cup holder rattle. A single empty paper coffee cup inside it began to dance a tiny, erratic circle. Chloe switched on the heater. The fan squealed, a high-pitched, metallic protest that eventually gave way to a lukewarm gust of air that smelled of dust and rotting leaves from the cowl intake. She leaned her head back against the headrest, closing her eyes. The rhythmic thump-thump of the rain on the thin metal roof was loud, a chaotic percussion that seemed to vibrate directly inside her skull. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. The vibration was a dull, rhythmic scrape against her hip. She pulled it out. It was a text from her mother. "Also ask mechanic if he can do it for cash. Tell him we are old friends. Don't pay more than $50. Chloe looked at the screen. The mechanic, a man named Dave, whose family had run the auto shop down the street for 40 years, was not an old friend. He was a business owner who had politely tolerated her mother's demands for discounts because Chloe always spoke to him with extreme apologetic politeness. Every time her father's delivery van needed an oil change or a brake pad replacement, Chloe was the one sent to negotiate, translating her mother's aggressive demands into soft, pleading requests for budget flexibility. Last time, Dave had looked at Chloe with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Chloe, I've got payroll to meet too," he'd said, wiping grease from his hands onto a red rag. "I can't keep doing these cash under-the-table favors. Tell your dad this is the last time." She remembered the hot prickle of shame that had climbed up her neck that afternoon. She had gone home and lied to her parents, telling them the price was $50 when it had actually been $85. She had paid the remaining $35 out of her own bank account, the one she was supposed to be saving for her apartment deposit with Julian. She looked at her mother's message. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. Usually, her fingers would automatically begin typing a draft. "Hi, Dave. Sorry to bother you so late, but our van is making a squeaking sound." She would spend 10 minutes balancing the tone, trying to protect her family's pride while avoiding Dave's irritation. Instead, Chloe slid her thumb to the top of the screen. She swiped left on the notification and hit delete. The screen went dark, reflecting the orange glow of the dashboard lights across her eyes. She did not call Dave. She did not draft an email. She simply put the phone into the cup holder, replacing the dancing coffee cup, and pulled the gear shift back into reverse. The drive to the restaurant took 18 minutes through the heavy, waterlogged evening traffic. Every time she stopped at a red light, the wipers dragged across the windshield with a dry, screeching rub, leaving greasy gray arcs directly in her line of sight. Her father had refused to let her buy new wiper blades during her last service. "Just wipe them with vinegar," he had told her in Korean, his voice dismissive as he pressed a silk tie. "Wipers are a scam. They are just rubber. Vinegar makes them soft again." Chloe had tried the vinegar. It hadn't worked. Now she simply peered through the smeared glass, her eyes straining against the glare of oncoming headlights that bloomed into massive, distorted starbursts through the rain-streaked windshield. At 7:08 p.m., she pulled into the gravel parking lot of Le Petit Hibou, a small, upscale French bistro 3 miles from her parents' shop. The transition was abrupt. Here, the cars were clean, quiet European SUVs that did not rattle when they idle. The gravel crunching under her tires sounded expensive, like dry autumn leaves being crushed under leather boots. Through the large, warm-paned windows of the restaurant, she could see the soft glow of amber pendant lamps. People were laughing, their shoulders moving easily, their hands holding slim-stemmed wine glasses. The air inside that glass box looked warm, dry, and clean. She turned off the engine. The sudden silence in the car was heavy, filled only with the cooling tick of the metal under the hood and the steady, relentless drum of the rain on the roof. She reached down and pulled her canvas bag onto her lap. The paper citation in the outer pocket rustled. She slid her fingers inside, feeling the dry, stiff texture of the county's letterhead. It was a physical weight, a small bomb with a 7-day fuse, sitting quietly in her purse. She had exactly $84 left in her checking account after paying her portion of the rent deposit on the apartment she and Julian had signed for last week. The deposit had drained almost everything she had saved from her part-time tutoring job. The job she could only do on Tuesday and Thursday evenings after her university classes, before she had to run back to the dry cleaners to close the register. If she didn't fix the citation, the city would close the shop in 3 days. If the shop closed, her father would lose his livelihood. And if her father lost his livelihood, the first thing he would do was demand she return the apartment deposit to help pay the mortgage on their house. He would do it without anger, simply stating it as a fact of nature. You are our daughter. We are family. We have to help each other. Chloe took a deep breath. The air in the car was growing cold quickly now. The windshield was beginning to fog up from her breath, the white mist creeping inward from the edges of the glass, slowly erasing the warm amber lights of the restaurant outside. She calculated the timing. The lease for the new apartment started in exactly 20 days. The keys would be handed over on the 1st of the month. If she kept the citation a secret, her parents would continue to operate as if nothing was wrong. They would ignore the warnings because they couldn't read them. They would ignore the inspector because they always did. And by the time the county actually sent the sheriff to post the padlock notice on the front door of Hans Prestige Cleaners, Chloe would already have her name on a mailbox 3 neighborhoods away. She took her hand out of her bag. She left the paper where it was. Opening the car door, she stepped out into the cold, wet air. The rain immediately soaked into the shoulders of her trench coat, but she did not run toward the warm, inviting light of the restaurant. She walked slowly, her heels sinking slightly into the wet gravel, her eyes fixed on the glass door where Julian sat waiting. The air inside the restaurant was heavy with the smell of melted butter, roasted garlic, and the clean, dry warmth of a well-maintained heating system. As the hostess took Chloe's damp trench coat, Chloe felt a sudden, sharp wave of exposure. Without the heavy canvas bag resting against her hip and the wet fabric shielding her body, she felt small under the soft, amber track lighting. "Table for 2 under Julian," she murmured. The hostess smiled, a polite, effortless gesture that required no negotiation, and led her through the narrow aisles of the dining room. Chloe's boots made a soft, rubbery squeak on the polished oak floorboards. Julian was already sitting in a corner booth, his shoulders relaxed against the dark green leather. He was scrolling through his phone, but the moment he saw her, his face brightened. He stood up, smoothing the front of his gray merino wool sweater, and stepped out of the booth to kiss her cheek. His skin smelled of sandalwood and the cold rain he had walked through minutes before. "You made it," he said, pulling her chair out for her. "I was worried traffic on the connector would be a mess. It's coming down hard out there." "It's fine," Chloe said, sliding into the seat. Her fingers immediately found the edge of the heavy, cream-colored linen napkin on the plate. She began to unfold it, her fingers tracing the neat, stiff seams. It was ironed perfectly, no starch buildup, no yellowed edges. The restaurant outsourced their laundry to a commercial linen service that used high-end industrial flatwork ironers. She knew this because her father had once tried to bid on a similar contract for a boutique hotel downtown, only for Chloe to realize, while translating the insurance requirements, that their small shop didn't carry even a fraction of the liability coverage needed. "You look a little pale," Julian said, leaning forward. His hands rested on the table, fingers neat, nails trimmed and clean. He didn't have the yellowed calluses of a presser or the dry, white-rimmed knuckles of a washer. "Rough day at the shop?" "The usual," Chloe said. She took a sip of the ice water the waiter had set down. The condensation on the outside of the glass was cold, wetting her fingertips. "Just a lot of paperwork." "Did the SBA loan documents finally go through?" Chloe paused. She watched a single drop of water slide down the side of her glass, cutting a clear path through the frost before pooling on the dark wood of the table. "They're reviewing it," she said. It was another lie, but it felt remarkably light. The truth, that the loan had been rejected 3 days ago because her father had hidden his cash ledger, was a massive, jagged rock. If she brought it to the table, Julian would try to analyze it. He would use his corporate consulting brain to suggest restructuring their debt, or hiring a forensic accountant, or doing a cash flow analysis. He would speak with the easy confidence of someone who believed that every problem had a logical, bureaucratic solution if you just applied enough process. He didn't understand that for her parents, the business was not a process, it was a bunker. And inside a bunker, you don't let strangers look at your rations. "Well, hopefully they get it sorted soon," Julian said, opening his menu. "You've spent enough weekends translating their tax returns. You need a break. Once we move into the new place next month, we're setting some rules. No more emergency accounting sessions on Sunday nights." He smiled, but there was a quiet, firm edge to his voice. He had been patient for the 2 years they had been dating, but his patience had lately taken on the quality of a project manager waiting for a delayed deliverable. He saw her family as a temporary obstacle, an administrative knot that Chloe just needed to be brave enough to untie. "Look at the specials," Julian continued, pointing a clean finger at the small card slipped inside the leather menu cover. "They have a duck confit tonight. I remember you saying you wanted to try it." Chloe looked down at the menu. The duck confit was $38. Her mind, programmed by 2 decades of surviving on the razor-thin margins of a service business, immediately ran the calculation. $38. To earn that, her father had to dry clean 15 shirts. That meant 15 times he had to manually inspect the collars. 15 times he had to load them into the perk machine. 15 times he had to pull the heavy, steaming press down. And 15 times her mother had to slide the plastic bags over the hangers, wire by wire. And that was before the cost of the chemicals, before the rent on the shop, before the utility bill that her mother had left on the kitchen counter this morning, unpaid. "The roast chicken looks good too," Chloe said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe just that." "Chloe, come on, it's a celebration," Julian said gently. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His palm was warm and dry. "My review went incredibly well today. Marcus told me I'm on track for senior associate by the end of the quarter. We can afford the duck." "Congratulations, Julian," she said, and she meant it. She looked at his face, at the neat, uncomplicated happiness in his eyes. He belonged here. He belonged in this room with the amber lights and the clean linen and the $38 duck. He belonged in a world where hard work resulted in a linear progression of rewards. "Thanks," he said, squeezing her hand. "But seriously, let's toast to the apartment. We get the keys on the 1st. I talked to the landlord today about the freight elevator reservation for the move. It's all set. We just need to pack." He withdrew his hand to pick up his wine glass. "Have you told your parents yet?" he asked. The question hung in the warm air between them, resting on the table like an uninvited guest. The waiter appeared at that moment, his pad ready, saving her from having to answer immediately. Julian ordered the duck and a bottle of Pinot Noir. Chloe ordered the chicken, her voice flat, her eyes fixed on the salt shaker. As the waiter walked away, Julian looked at her again, his brow furrowing slightly. "Chloe, you haven't told them, have you?" "I'm going to," she said. "We signed the lease last week," he reminded her, his voice dropping to a lower, more serious register. "The move is in 3 weeks. They need to find someone to cover your hours at the counter. They need to hire an actual assistant, Chloe. You can't keep running their business and working your own job while we're trying to set up our life." "I know," she said. "They're going to be fine," Julian said, his tone softening into that analytical, comforting warmth that always made her feel like a client being managed. "They've been running that shop since before you were born. They survived before you learned English, and they'll survive after you move out. It's just weaponized incompetence, sweetie. If you keep doing it for them, they'll never hire help." Weaponized incompetence. It was a phrase he had read in an article about workplace dynamics, and he had eagerly applied it to her parents. He thought her mother didn't learn English because she was lazy. He thought her father didn't handle the city permits because he knew Chloe would do it if he waited long enough. He didn't see the terror behind their silence. He didn't see her mother's hands shaking when a white mail carrier handed her a letter with a government seal. He didn't understand that to them, the English language was a maze of hidden traps, and Chloe was the only map they had. She looked at her water glass. The pool of condensation had grown larger, spreading across the dark wood of the table until it touched the base of her silverware. "You're right," Chloe said, her voice quiet and perfectly still. "They will survive." The food arrived on heavy, wide-rimmed porcelain plates that retained the kitchen's high heat. Julian's duck confit sat atop a bed of braised red cabbage, its skin blistered to a deep mahogany brown. Chloe's roasted chicken was framed by tiny, charred fingerling potatoes and a gloss of rosemary-infused jus. Julian immediately picked up his knife, his movements clean and practiced. He sliced into the duck, the crisp skin crackling softly under the blade, a small, satisfying sound that was lost to the general hum of the dining room. "The cabbage is incredible," he said, chewing thoughtfully before pointing the tip of his fork toward her plate. "Try yours. You need to eat." Chloe picked up her fork. The silver was heavy, weighted at the base so that it balanced perfectly between her index and middle fingers. She cut a small piece of the chicken. The meat was tender, but as she chewed, she found she could barely taste it. It felt like dry fiber in her mouth. Her throat felt tight, as if the sweet, chemical air of the dry cleaners had settled there permanently, forming a thin, impervious lining that blocked out the taste of butter and herbs. "It's very good," she said softly. Julian smiled, taking a sip of the red wine. The Pinot Noir left a thin, purple ring around the inside of his glass when he set it down. "I'm telling you, once we're in the new place, everything is going to change. We can actually host people. My colleague, Dave, from the advisory team, he and his wife do these casual wine nights. We've been wanting to invite them over for months, but my studio is just too small for 4 people. He pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped the screen, turning it toward her. He had a Pinterest board open, titled Living Room Ideals. "Look at this sofa," he said, sliding his thumb across the screen to show her a low-profile, cream-colored sectional. "It's a modular setup. If we get the 3-piece configuration, it'll fit perfectly against the east wall by the bay window. It's on sale right now. We could order it this weekend and schedule the delivery for the second day of the lease." Chloe looked at the screen. The price beneath the image was $1,850. To her, the numbers didn't represent a sofa. They represented exactly 74 winter coats. 74 coats that had to be unbuttoned, checked for pockets containing old tissues or loose change, tagged with red plastic strips, loaded into the drum, deodorized, pressed on the form finisher, touched up by hand, slipped into plastic sleeves, and hung on the conveyor. It was roughly 3 weeks of continuous physical labor for her mother and father, working from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. "It's very nice," she said. "It's performance linen," Julian added, his voice full of the quiet satisfaction of someone who had researched his purchase thoroughly. "So even if we spill wine, it cleans right up. We don't have to worry about ruining it." He set the phone down on the table, right next to his water glass. Almost instantly, the screen lit up again. It didn't make a sound. Julian kept his phone on silent during dinners, but the bright blue light of the display caught the corner of Chloe's eye. The notification was not from Julian's phone. It was from hers, sitting face up in her lap beneath the linen napkin. She lowered her gaze. The white text on the black lock screen read, "Dad, Mrs. Gable here. She say blue dress ruined. She very angry. We don't know what she say. She look at computer. Come shop now." Chloe stared at the screen. Mrs. Gable was their most difficult customer, a woman who lived in the gated development 3 miles north of the shop. She brought in vintage garments, difficult, fragile pieces made of raw silk, antique lace, or weighted rayon, and demanded they be returned in pristine condition for the standard dry cleaning price. Whenever Mrs. Gable arrived, Chloe's mother would instantly find an excuse to retreat to the back room, leaving Chloe to handle the woman's sharp, impatient sighs. Mrs. Gable spoke in a high, rapid-fire tone, using terms like delicate fiber stabilization and solvent residue. To Chloe's father, who understood only basic noun-verb structures in English, her voice was just a series of hostile metallic noises. Chloe knew exactly what had happened. Her father had likely run Mrs. Gable's silk dress through the standard high-temperature perk cycle instead of doing a cold solvent hand wash, stripping the natural oils from the silk and leaving it limp, faded, and puckered at the seams. And now Mrs. Gable was standing at the front counter, her arms crossed, demanding to know how they were going to compensate her for a $900 vintage garment, while Jin Woo stood there, sweating, pretending to search the computer system because he didn't know how to say, "We made a mistake." "Come shop now." The words were a command, written with the absolute certainty that Chloe would drop whatever she was doing, apologize to whoever she was with, and drive through the rain to stand between her father and his shame. "Chloe?" Julian's voice pulled her back. He was looking at her, his fork suspended over his plate. "Are you okay? You're staring at your lap." Chloe looked up. She forced her shoulders to drop, releasing a pocket of tension she hadn't realized she was holding in her neck. "Just a notification," she said. "Is it them?" Julian's tone shifted, the warmth in his eyes cooling into a familiar, protective irritation. "Did they text you?" "My dad," she said. "What do they want?" "There's an issue with a customer," Chloe said, her voice dry. She picked up her water glass, taking a slow sip to coat her throat. "He wants me to go to the shop." Julian set his fork down with a small, sharp clack against the porcelain. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "It's 7:30 on a Thursday, Chloe. The shop closes in 30 minutes. If they have a customer issue, they can tell them to come back tomorrow morning. This is exactly what we were talking about. They're 40-year-old adults, and they are treating you like an on-call translation app." He wasn't wrong. but his logical framework didn't account for the absolute terror of the alternative. If she didn't go, her father would likely get defensive. He would raise his voice in Korean, which Mrs. Gable would interpret as aggression. Mrs. Gable would write a devastating one-star review on Yelp, or she would call the police, or she would threaten a lawsuit, and the fragile, paper-thin piece of her parents' household would shatter for the next month. Chloe looked down at her lap again. The phone screen had gone black. She calculated the metabolic cost. If she left now, she would have to apologize to Julian. The car ride back would be tense and silent. She would arrive at the shop to find her mother crying in the back and her father standing in the front, his face red, his jaw set in that stubborn, furious line he used when he was terrified. She would have to swallow her own pride, apologize to Mrs. Gable in her most submissive, polite English, and offer to pay for the dress out of her own pocket to keep her from calling the Better Business Bureau. She would lose another $300 from her savings. The apartment deposit would be compromised, and tomorrow her parents would treat her exactly the same way, an invisible, necessary gear in a machine they refuse to maintain. She reached down, took her phone, and turned it completely off. The screen went black, extinguishing the small blue light in her lap. She slid the phone deep into her canvas bag, which sat on the floor by her feet, buried beneath her wet trench coat. "I'm not going," Chloe said. Julian looked at her, his eyebrows rising in surprise. The irritation on his face melted into a slow, approving smile. "Really?" he asked, as if he had just witnessed a small, quiet miracle. "Really," she said. She picked up her knife and fork, her hands perfectly steady. She cut another piece of the roasted chicken, dipped it in the rosemary jus, and put it in her mouth. This time, she forced herself to taste the salt. "The chicken is cold, but it's fine." The drive back to her parents' house was a slow, dark crawl through the dying tail of the evening rush. The rain had settled into a steady, freezing drizzle that turned the asphalt into a black sheet, reflecting the harsh glare of red brake lights. Chloe drove in silence. She had turned the radio off, preferring the rhythmic, raspy sweep of the worn windshield wipers to any background noise. The cold air from the vents had finally warmed up, but it brought with it the faint, toasted sugar smell of a slow coolant leak deep behind the dashboard. Another minor mechanical failure her father had refused to address. "It still runs," Jinwoo had said when she pointed out the sweet smell months ago. "Cars in America are built to make you spend money. Just put water in the radiator if it gets hot." She parked her Civic in the driveway behind her father's white delivery van. The van sat crookedly on the cracked concrete, its rusted rear bumper nearly touching the overgrown hedge of juniper bushes. The house was a modest, split-level ranch, its pale yellow siding dulled by decades of road grime and rain. A single, low-wattage yellow bulb burned above the front door, casting a sickly, jaundiced glow over the concrete steps. Through the thin polyester curtains of the living room window, Chloe could see the flickering, blue-white light of the television. She turned off the ignition. The engine died with a wet, shuddering gasp. For a long moment, Chloe did not move. She sat in the dark car, her hands resting on the cold steering wheel, watching the yellow light of the porch. Her phone, still switched off, sat heavy in her canvas bag on the passenger seat. She didn't want to turn it on. To turn it on was to open a floodgate of missed calls, urgent text messages, and voicemail notifications that would demand her immediate, exhausting attention. She calculated the time. It was 8:42 p.m. The shop had closed at 8 p.m. Her parents would have been home for at least 20 minutes. If Mrs. Gable's confrontation had gone badly, and it almost certainly had, the house would be thick with the quiet, vibrating tension that usually preceded a family storm. She took a deep breath, gathered her bag, and opened the car door. The cold wind caught her immediately, sending a sharp shiver down her spine as she walked up the driveway. When she unlocked the front door and stepped into the small entryway, the familiar smell of the house hit her. A mixture of boiled cabbage, sesame oil, damp carpet, and the heavy, medicinal scent of the menthol patch her mother wore on her lower back. She kicked off her wet boots, placing them neatly on the plastic tray by the door. "Minji?" Her mother's voice came from the kitchen, sharp and thin. Chloe walked down the short hallway. The fluorescent bulb in the kitchen ceiling flickered twice before settling into a high-pitched hum. Her father was sitting at the laminate dining table, his sleeves rolled up, a green bottle of Jinro soju and a single small glass in front of him. His face was flushed a dark, mottled red, not just from the alcohol, but from the lingering heat of anger. Her mother, Unji, was standing by the sink, her hands buried in soapy, lukewarm water. She was scrubbing a stainless steel rice pot with a piece of steel wool, the harsh scritch-scratch sound filling the small room. Neither of them looked at her directly. This was the opening move of their silent war, a ritual Chloe knew by heart. "Where were you?" Jinwoo asked. He didn't look up from his glass. He filled it to the brim, his hand shaking slightly, before tossing the liquor back in one quick, practiced motion. "We called you 10 times. Your mother called. I called. Your phone was dead." "My battery died," Chloe said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the frantic, apologetic tone she usually used to de-escalate him. Jinwoo set the glass down with a sharp clink against the laminate table. "Your battery died? You are a young person. You always have your phone. How does your battery die when we are having an emergency?" Unji stopped scrubbing the pot, though she kept her hands submerged in the dirty water. "That woman, the Gable woman, she came back. She was shouting. She was waving her hands. She pointed at the computer. Your father didn't know what she was saying, so he just kept saying, 'No, no, come back tomorrow.' She said she is going to call the police. She said we ruined her mother's dress, a vintage dress." Her mother turned her head slightly, her eyes narrow and accusing. "She wouldn't leave. Your father had to give her $500 in cash from the register just to make her go away. $500, Minji. That is 2 weeks of laundry profit, gone because you didn't answer your phone." Chloe looked at her father. He was staring at the wall behind her, his jaw tight, his chest rising and falling in shallow, heavy breaths. He was waiting for her to apologize. He was waiting for her to say, "I'm so sorry. I'll call her tomorrow and get the money back." Or, "I'll write an email to the county to explain." He was waiting for her to assume the burden of his mistake, as she had done when he backed the delivery van into a customer's brick mailbox 2 years ago. She looked at her mother's wet, red hands. She looked at the green bottle of soju. "The dress was silk," Chloe said quietly. "You put it in the hot cycle." Jinwoo's head snapped toward her, his eyes flashing with sudden, defensive fury. "What do you know about cycles? I have been dry cleaning since before you were born. The silk was old. It was cheap. She brought us a rotten dress so she could scam us for money, and because you weren't there to tell her to leave, we had to pay her." "You didn't have to pay her," Chloe said, her voice remaining perfectly level, almost detached. "You could have told her to wait until tomorrow." "How?" Jinwoo shouted, his hands slamming down on the table, making the small glass jump. "How do I tell her that? I don't have the words. You are the one who is supposed to handle the customers. That is why we pay for your college. That is why you live in this house." The words hung in the humid kitchen air, heavy and suffocating. Usually, this was the point where Chloe's defense would break. She would start crying, her chest aching with the familiar, desperate need to prove that she was a good daughter, that she was grateful for their sacrifices, that she wasn't the selfish traitor they accused her of being. She would spend the rest of the night on her knees in the living room, drafting legal letters or calculating how to squeeze $500 out of their dwindling business accounts to make up for the loss. But tonight, the prickle of tears didn't come. She felt only a cold, hollow emptiness. She looked at her father's red face, and for the first time in her life, she saw him not as a terrifying giant of parental authority, but as a small, frightened man who had built a wall of anger to hide his own helplessness. "I'm going to bed," Chloe said. She turned and walked out of the kitchen before either of them could speak. Behind her, the scratching sound of the steel wool on the rice pot did not resume. The kitchen was completely silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the old refrigerator and the muffled, tinny laughter of the television in the other room. Her parents stood frozen in their own kitchen, paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying realization that their daughter had simply stopped carrying their weight. The radiator in Chloe's bedroom woke her at 6:10 a.m. It was a familiar, hostile noise, a series of sharp, metallic bangs, like someone striking the iron pipes with a ball-peen hammer, followed by a long, wet hiss that did nothing to warm the drafty corner of the room. Chloe lay still under her thin polyester duvet, watching her breath form a faint white mist in the gray morning light. The window beside her bed was lined with condensation that had frozen into delicate, fern-like patterns along the aluminum frame. She did not want to move. Her body felt stiff, as though the cold had seeped deep into her joints overnight, anchoring her to the mattress. But the routine was a physical track she had walked for so long that her muscles seemed to move on their own. She pulled her legs out from under the covers, her bare feet instantly flinching as they touched the icy, worn hardwood floor. Downstairs, the house was already awake. She could hear the rhythmic, heavy thud of the rice cooker lid shutting in the kitchen, followed by the dull, metallic scratch of her mother's metal ladle scraping the bottom of the pot. Then came the smell: boiled barley, toasted sesame oil, and the sharp, sour tang of fermented kimchi being fried in a pan. It was a heavy, comforting smell that had defined every morning of her life, yet today it felt oppressive, like a thick blanket being pressed over her face. Chloe dressed in her usual uniform, a black, oversized knit sweater, dark jeans, and her hair pulled back into a tight, low bun. She grabbed her canvas bag from the desk. The paper citation in the front pocket was slightly crumpled now, its edge sticking out like a white tab. She pushed it back down, hiding it beneath the strap of her laptop. When she walked into the kitchen, her mother was standing by the stove, her back to the door. Her father was already at the table, his eyes red-rimmed and small, staring into a bowl of steaming rice. He was wearing his work clothes, a faded blue polo shirt with Hans Prestige Cleaners embroidered in peeling white letters over his chest. The silence in the room was dense, almost physical, stretching from the linoleum floor to the yellowed ceiling panels. Chloe walked to the counter to pour herself a glass of water. The tap water was freezing, sending a sharp ache through her teeth as she drank. Unji did not turn around, but she set a frying pan down on the burner with a loud metallic clank that made the small jars of red pepper flakes on the spice rack rattle. "The mechanic," Unji said, her voice flat and raspy, addressing the tile wall above the stove. "Did you call him last night before your battery died?" Chloe set her water glass down on the counter. The sound of the glass touching the laminate was quiet, but in the silent kitchen it sounded like a small snap. "No," Chloe said. Her father's chopstick stopped halfway to his mouth. He looked up, his brow furrowing into deep, dark lines that ran from his nose to his forehead. He stared at her, waiting for the explanation, the excuse, the frantic apology. "Why not?" Jinwoo asked, his voice low and gravelly. "I told you the van is making a sound. If the belt breaks on the highway while I am doing the morning pickup, we lose the whole day. Do you want me to get stuck on the road?" "I had to study for my midterm," Chloe said. She did not raise her voice. She did not look at either of them. She kept her eyes on the small, dark knot in the wood of the kitchen table. "And I don't have Dave's personal number. You have his card in the drawer by the register." "You know Dave," her mother said, finally turning around. Her face was tight, her lips pressed into a thin, white line. "He listens to you. If your father calls, Dave doesn't understand him. He charges us the full price because he thinks we are stupid. You have to call." "I have a class at 8, Chloe said, checking her watch. It was 6:45 a.m. "I need to leave now if I want to find parking on campus." "The van," Jinwoo repeated, his voice rising, the redness returning to his neck. "What about the van? You think your classes are more important than the business? Who do you think pays for your books? Who pays for the gas in your car?" The guilt was a well-worn groove in Chloe's mind. For years, they had used it like a rudder, steering her exactly where they needed her to go. Every tuition bill, every grocery receipt, every dollar spent on her dental cleanings had been logged in an invisible ledger, brought out and read aloud whenever she tried to claim a single hour of her own time. Usually, this was the moment she would bend. She would take out her phone, apologize for her selfishness, and make the call to Dave right there at the kitchen table, using her sweetest, most pleading voice to beg for a same-day appointment and a cash discount. But today, she looked at her father's red neck and the ledger felt empty. The numbers didn't add up anymore. She had spent 10 years of her life translating their tax returns, their lawsuits, their lease agreements, their medical forms, and their customer complaints. She had given them her weekends, her evenings, and her peace of mind. She had already paid the debt. "The card is in the black box by the register," Chloe said, her voice steady and quiet. "Dave is very nice. If you speak slowly, he will understand." She picked up her canvas bag and walked toward the front door. "Minji!" her mother called out, her voice dropping its anger and replacing it with a sudden, sharp note of panic. "Minji, wait. The city man. The paper he left on the microwave. You said you were going to email them. Did you do it?" Chloe stopped in the entryway. She was already sliding her feet into her damp leather boots. The citation, the 7-day warning. She looked down at her hands as she tied her laces. Her fingers were slightly stiff from the morning cold. "I'll look at it later," Chloe said. "They said we have to pay," Unji said, her voice coming from the kitchen door now. She had followed her daughter to the hallway, her spatula still in her hand, looking suddenly small against the dark wood of the door frame. "Your father is worried. He says they will lock the machines." "I'll handle it," Chloe said. It was the same phrase she had used 1,000 times before. To her mother, it was a guarantee. It meant the magic would happen behind the scenes, that the white papers with the scary government seals would disappear into Chloe's bag and turn into emails and phone calls that made the bad things go away. But as Chloe turned the brass doorknob and stepped out into the freezing gray drizzle of the morning, she knew the magic was gone. She was just a girl with a piece of paper in her pocket, walking away from a house that was slowly starting to cold. The lecture hall was a cavernous, steeply tiered room of raw concrete and scarred wood. It smelled of wet wool, damp umbrellas, and the stale, sharp ozone of 60 laptops running simultaneously. Chloe sat in the third row, her fingers wrapped around a yellow wooden pencil. Her thumb pressed against the flat side of the graphite core, feeling the small, sharp ridge where the wood had been shaved away by the metal sharpener. The clock on the wall above the whiteboard was a massive industrial circle of white plastic. Its black second hand moved with a heavy mechanical shook, 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 pausing for a fraction of a second at each tick before dropping to the next. Shook, shook. For 2 hours, the only other sound in the room was the collective, frantic scratch of 80 pencils against rough, recycled exam paper. Chloe looked down at her exam. It was an advanced accounting midterm, capital gains taxation, and corporate entity restructuring. The questions were complex, requiring multi-layered calculations of tax liabilities across international borders. To her classmates, the numbers were abstract formulas, a logic puzzle to be solved for an A. To Chloe, the numbers had faces. Every time she calculated a depreciation schedule or a tax bracket threshold, she saw the yellowed ledgers of Hans Prestige Cleaners. She saw the line items for solvent disposal that her father had tried to write off as cleaning supplies, and the cash payments to the part-time pressers that she had had to carefully reconcile in the margins of her personal spreadsheets so the IRS wouldn't audit them. She finished her exam with 20 minutes to spare. She did not turn it in early. She sat with her hands folded over the yellow paper, her pencil resting in the groove of the desk, and watched the second hand of the clock complete its slow, circular march. In her pocket, her phone was silent, but she could feel the faint, rhythmic pulse of its vibration. It had buzzed 3 times in the last 40 minutes. Each buzz was a tiny, localized heat on her thigh, a physical reminder of the world she had left behind at 6:45 a.m. When the professor finally called for the papers to be passed forward, Chloe stood up. Her knees made a small, dry pop. She walked down the concrete steps of the lecture hall, slipped her pencil into her bag, and walked out into the main corridor. The campus hallway was loud, a chaotic wash of voices, laughter, and the squeak of sneakers on the wet linoleum. She found a quiet alcove near the emergency exit, behind a vending machine that hummed with a low, vibrating rattle. She took out her phone. There were 4 missed calls and 3 text messages. The first was from her father, sent at 9:14 a.m. Dave say he busy, no come today. The van sound worse when I go to commercial laundry. Minji, you call him. Tell him it is urgent. He will come if you call. The second was from her mother, sent at 10:05 a.m. A man from the county came, not the same one. He left a pink paper on the glass door. He looked angry. Your father shouted at him to go away. Minji, where are you? Why are you not answering? The third was from her father again, sent 10 minutes ago. Where is the cash book? We need to check the Gable woman's receipt. Your mother cannot find it. Call us immediately. Chloe stared at the screen. The pink paper. She knew what the pink paper was. It was a notice of immediate order to comply, the final step before the county health department issued a formal closure order. If her father had shouted at the inspector, the timeline would have shrunk. The 7 days she had calculated last night were no longer a buffer. The city wouldn't wait until next week. They would come with the locks by tomorrow afternoon, or Monday morning at the latest. She looked at her father's text about the cash book. "Where is the cash book? Your mother cannot find it." The cash book, a black leather ledger with red-lined columns, was not lost. It was sitting exactly where it had sat for 6 years, on the lower shelf of the safe, behind the coat carousel, tucked behind 3 boxes of extra-strength steam valve washers. Her mother knew this, but her mother didn't want to bend down, reach into the dark, grease-smelling space behind the heavy iron safe, and search for it themselves. They wanted Chloe to do it. They wanted her to say, "I'll come get it for you," or "I'll find it when I come in after class." They wanted her to remain the keeper of their secrets, the only one who knew where the money was buried and how much of it was missing. Chloe's thumb hovered over the keyboard. She could type, "It's in the safe behind the washers." It would take 5 seconds. It would resolve their immediate panic. It would keep the machine running for another few hours. But if she did, the thread would tighten. They would ask her about the pink paper. They would ask her to call Dave again. They would ask her to come to the shop at 3 p.m. to translate for a customer who wanted to return a stained duvet. She looked at her finger on the glass screen. The drop of blood from yesterday had turned into a tiny, hard brown scab on her knuckle, barely visible unless she caught the light. She slid her phone back into her pocket without typing a single character. She walked out of the alcove, her boots clicking softly on the tile floor as she headed toward the student union. The air outside was still gray and cold, but through the glass doors of the campus library, she could see the warm, quiet rows of bookshelves, silent and undisturbed by the frantic, steam-choked reality of Hans' prestige cleaners. She had 2 hours before her next class. Usually she would use this time to drive to the shop, eat a cold kimbap her mother had wrapped in foil, and stand at the register for 90 minutes while her father took a nap on a pile of dirty blankets in the back. Today she walked to the 3rd floor of the library, found a desk by the window overlooking the wet quad, and opened her accounting textbook to Chapter 12, The Liquidation of Partnerships. The 3rd floor of the university library was reserved for silent study. Here, the air was still and cool, tasting faintly of paper dust, floor wax, and the dry, warm scent of old leather bindings. Chloe sat at a mahogany carrel by the tall, arched window. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the campus trees bare and glistening, their black branches dripping water onto the gray slate paths below. Occasionally, a student would pass by on the sidewalk, their head tucked down against the wind, their figure small and silent from this height. In front of her, the textbook lay open. She had been staring at the same page for 20 minutes. Section 12.4, Allocation of Deficiencies in Partnership Liquidation. Her notebook was open beside it. She had written 3 lines of neat blue ink notes, her handwriting precise and vertical. But her pen had stopped, resting on the paper long enough for a small, round dot of ink to bleed into the fiber of the page, forming a tiny, dark blue flower. Her phone began to buzz. It was not a quick text notification. It was a sustained, rhythmic vibration that made her wooden carrel hum. The phone danced a fraction of an inch across the polished wood before Chloe caught it with her palm. The caller ID read, Mom. Chloe looked at the blinking screen. Usually, she would decline the call in the library, immediately followed by a frantic text, "In class, what's wrong?" Today, she did not send a text. She stood up, her chair scraping softly on the carpet, and walked toward the heavy glass doors that led to the tiled stairwell. She pushed the door open, the quiet hum of the library replaced by the hollow, echoing cold of the concrete stairs. She pressed accept and held the phone to her ear. "Minji!" Her mother's voice was too loud for the quiet stairwell, the sound distorted by the cheap speaker of her phone. In the background, Chloe could hear the rhythmic, metallic clank-clack of the conveyor belt in the shop, but it sounded slower than usual, as if the motor were struggling. "Where are you?" Unji asked in Korean, her voice sharp with a mixture of anger and panic. "Why are you not answering? We have been looking for the cash book for an hour. Your father found it, but it's the wrong one. This is from last year. Where is the new one?" "It's in the safe," Chloe said. Her voice was low and perfectly level, bouncing off the raw concrete walls of the stairwell. Behind the box of extra steam valve washers, on the bottom shelf. There was a brief, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Chloe could hear her mother breathing, short, shallow gasps that indicated she had been rushing back and forth across the concrete floor of the shop. "Why did you put it there?" Unji complained, her tone shifting from panic to annoyance now that the mystery was solved. "Your father had to bend down. You know his back is bad today. He had to lift those heavy laundry bags this morning because Dave didn't come to fix the van. The van is sitting in the alley. It won't start at all now." Unji paused, waiting for Chloe to say something. She was waiting for her daughter to gasp, to apologize for her father's back, to curse Dave for his laziness, to promise she would find another mechanic immediately. Chloe said nothing. She listened to the hum of the static on the line. "Minji," her mother said, her voice dropping into a lower, more suspicious register. "Are you listening?" "I'm listening," Chloe said. "Your father's shoulder is very bad," her mother continued, returning to the familiar, rhythmic guilt delivery she had perfected over decades. "He is lying on the small sofa in the back office right now. He had to use the ice pack from the freezer. We have 25 bags of shirts that need to be delivered to the dry cleaning route by 5 o'clock. You need to come as soon as your class is finished. You have to drive your car. We can fit 10 bags in your trunk and you can make 2 trips." Chloe looked down at her boots. There was a small gray salt stain on the toe of her left shoe from the winter slush. If she agreed, she would have to leave campus now. She would miss her afternoon lecture on corporate tax structures. She would spend 3 hours lifting heavy, plastic-wrapped bundles into her small Civic, the chemical smell of the clean clothes filling the small cabin until her eyes watered. She would have to navigate the narrow, wet residential streets, carrying 30-pound bundles up steps to the front doors of wealthy clients who would look at her with polite, distant indifference. And when she returned to the shop at 8 o'clock, her father would be sitting at the desk, his back miraculously improved enough for him to smoke a cigarette, while her mother complained that she had taken too long on the second trip. She ran the calculation. Her father had been lying on the small sofa with his back bad at least 3 times a month for the last 5 years. It was a physical state that always seemed to coincide with the arrival of heavy delivery days, or tax deadlines, or visits from the city inspectors. It was a physical state that dissolved the moment Chloe took the keys and stepped out into the rain. "I can't come," Chloe said. The line went completely quiet. Even the metallic clank of the conveyor belt in the background seemed to fade. "What did you say?" her mother asked. The Korean word was sharp, like a slap. "I can't come to the shop today," Chloe repeated. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with the same quiet, academic clarity she used when reciting accounting principles. "I have a study group after my afternoon class. We are preparing for the finals. And then I have to meet Julian to look at some furniture for the apartment." "Furniture?" Unji's voice rose to a shrill, disbelief-filled pitch. "Your father is lying on the floor with his back broken, and you are looking at furniture? With that boy?" To her mother, Julian was still that boy. A temporary distraction, a polite white face that Chloe was supposed to eventually discard when she realized her true duty was to the family. They had never invited him to the house for dinner. They had never asked about his job, his family, or his future. To them, his presence in Chloe's life was an annoyance, a competitor for the invisible resource that was Chloe's labor. "We need the keys to the apartment by the 1st, Chloe said. "We have to finalize the move-in details." "Your father pays for your car," her mother shouted, her voice shaking with a sudden hot rage. "We paid for your school. You think you are a big person now because you have an apartment? You are our daughter. If we tell you to come, you come." The stairwell was very cold. Chloe could feel the draft from the emergency exit door at the bottom of the landing, a thin, freezing knife of air that cut across her ankles. "The car is registered in my name," Chloe said softly, "and I paid the insurance last week with my tutoring money." She did not wait for her mother to reply. She did not want to hear the high, frantic scream of her mother's voice or the heavy, dramatic sigh of her father taking the phone to tell her she was an ungrateful child who was killing her parents. She pressed the red button. The screen went dark. The echoing stairwell returned to its quiet, raw, concrete stillness. Chloe stood on the landing for a long moment, her hand holding the cold metal of the door handle. Her chest did not feel tight. Her heart was not racing. She felt only a strange, clean lightness, as if she had just stepped off a heavy, iron platform that had been slowly sinking into the mud for 22 years. She pushed the glass door open and walked back into the silent library. The furniture showroom was a vast, quiet space of concrete floors and towering steel joists, partitioned into neat, beautifully lit mock living rooms and bedrooms. It smelled of freshly sawn pine, expensive leather, and the subtle, clean scent of soy wax candles burning near the register. Chloe walked slowly down the wide aisle, her boots making a soft, muffled sound on the polished concrete. Around her, families and young couples strolled through the displays, their voices low and relaxed, gesturing towards sectional sofas and oak dining tables with the easy confidence of people who had homes to fill. Julian was 10 feet ahead of her, standing in a mock dining room. He was holding a small silver tape measure, its metallic tongue extended across the surface of a light ash wood table. 72 inches, Julian said, releasing the lock. The tape measure returned to its metal housing with a sharp, echoing snap. He looked up at her, his face bright with enthusiasm. "It's perfect, Chloe. If we put it in the dining alcove, we'll still have 16 inches of clearance on either side for the chairs. We could easily seat 6 people." Chloe reached out and touched the edge of the table. The wood was smooth, matte-finished, and cool to the touch. There were no chemical residues here, no greasy films, no smell of scorched wool or stale steam. It was just raw, clean timber, precisely cut and sanded. "It's very nice," she said. "It's solid ash," Julian said, running his palm over the grain. "Not veneer. It'll last us 20 years. And the price is actually reasonable because of the floor model discount." He looked at her, his smile softening into something more observant. He set the tape measure down on the table and stepped closer, his hand finding her waist. "You still look like you're miles away. Are you sure you're okay? Your classes didn't go well?" "No, they went fine," Chloe said. She leaned into his touch slightly, her head resting against his shoulder. His wool sweater was dry and warm, smelling faintly of the crisp afternoon air. The midterm was long, but I think I did well. See, I told you, he said, kissing the top of her head. You worry too much. You've got this semester handled. Now we just need to get you out of that house so you can actually breathe. In her pocket, the phone vibrated. It was a single long pulse, then another. Chloe did not pull the phone out. She knew what the vibrations meant. Since she had hung up on her mother in the library stairwell 2 hours ago, the phone had vibrated every 15 to 20 minutes. She had set the ringer to silent, but the physical pulse of the motor against her leg was like a persistent, mechanical heartbeat. She calculated the progress of the collapse at the shop. Without the delivery van, her father would have had to make a choice. He either had to leave the 25 bags of clean laundry on the racks, which would result in dozens of angry phone calls from suburban clients who needed their suits for Friday morning business meetings, or he had to pay for a commercial courier or a taxi. Knowing her father's absolute horror of spending cash, he would have waited until the last possible second, pacing the concrete floor, smoking cigarettes by the back door, and shouting at her mother. But eventually, the fear of losing his contracts would have forced his hand. The phone vibrated again. Chloe slipped her hand into her coat pocket, her fingers finding the cold glass screen of the phone. She pressed the power button through the fabric, holding it down until she felt the 3 quick descending vibrations that indicated the device was shutting off completely. The physical pulse against her leg stopped. The silence that followed was immense, filling the large, beautifully lit showroom like a physical presence. "Let's look at the chairs," Chloe said, her voice quiet and steady. "They have some matching ash chairs over by the bedroom displays," Julian said, pointing toward the back of the store. "They have leather seats. We should test them out." They walked together through the mock rooms. As they walked, Chloe's mind ran through the numbers. The $500 cash her father had paid to Mrs. Gable, the cost of a taxi or private courier to deliver 25 large laundry bundles, easily $80 to $100 in city traffic. The impending cost of Dave the mechanic, who would now charge the maximum commercial rate because Chloe had not been there to politely beg for a discount. And the $1,500 city environmental citation, which was still sitting in the front pocket of her canvas bag, completely unaddressed. The deadline was Friday afternoon. Today was Thursday. Her parents had exactly 24 hours to figure out how to navigate the city's online compliance portal, translate a 3-page technical warning, and hire a certified remediation technician to inspect their dry cleaning machine, a task that required a level of English literacy and bureaucratic navigation they simply did not possess. For 22 years, Chloe had been the bridge. She had translated the city codes. She had filled out the quarterly emissions reports. She had spoken to the inspectors, and she had smoothed over the friction of their existence in a world they refused to understand. Now she had simply stepped away from the bridge. She watched Julian pull out an ash wood chair, its legs sliding silently over the polished concrete on small felt pads. He sat down, leaning back and looking up at her with a satisfied grin. "What do you think?" he asked. "Comfortable?" Chloe sat in the chair opposite him. The leather seat was firm and supportive. She rested her hands on the clean wood of the table, looking at Julian's bright, uncomplicated face. "Yes," she said, her voice dropping into the quiet warmth of the room. "It's very comfortable." Behind her, through the large glass windows of the showroom, the sky was turning a deep, bruised purple as the sun went down. Somewhere 3 miles away, in a damp, chemical-smelling shop under flickering fluorescent lights, her mother and father were likely standing by a broken van, staring at a pink piece of paper they couldn't read, waiting for a voice that was no longer coming. The glow of the dashboard clock read 10:14 p.m. when Chloe pulled into the driveway of her parents' house. The rain had stopped entirely, replaced by a dense, freezing fog that hung low over the asphalt, blurring the sharp edges of the suburban street. The white delivery van sat in the same crooked spot, a dark, heavy shape coated in a wet sheen that caught the orange light of the distant street lamp. She turned off the engine. The Civic's metal hood gave a series of quiet, cooling pops in the damp darkness. Chloe sat in the driver's seat, her eyes fixed on the house. The living room window was dark, but a faint blue-white light flickered from the small kitchen window at the side of the house. Her parents were still awake. She turned her phone back on. The screen bloomed to life, casting a harsh, cold light over her face. Within seconds, the notifications began to cascade down the display, a rapid-fire series of gray boxes. 6 missed calls from her father, 9 from her mother, 3 voicemails, and a text message from her mother, sent at 9:02 p.m., containing only a photograph. It was a blurry, poorly lit image of a bright red piece of paper taped to the glass front door of Hans Prestige Cleaners. Even through the grainy photo, Chloe could read the bold black lettering at the top. Notice of intent to suspend operating license. She stared at the image. The county health department didn't wait. Her father's shouting match with the inspector today had clearly accelerated their timeline. The initial 7-day compliance period had been overridden. Chloe locked her phone and slipped it into her pocket. The red paper was a final warning. If a certified remediation report was not submitted to the county health office by 5 p.m. tomorrow, Friday, the inspector would return on Monday morning with the city police to place a padlock on the front doors. She opened the car door. The cold night air immediately bit through her sweater, carrying the sharp, muddy smell of the wet juniper bushes. She walked up the steps and unlocked the front door. The brass handle felt like ice against her palm. Inside, the house was silent, but the air was thick with the heavy, camphoraceous smell of her father's pain relief patches. It was an olfactory footprint of his physical labor, a sharp medicinal cloud that always filled the hallway when he had spent the day lifting things he shouldn't have. She slipped off her boots, her movements slow and deliberate. "Minji?" The voice came from the kitchen. It was her father's voice, but it lacked the sharp, raspy edge of his usual anger. It sounded hollow, slightly muffled by the physical exhaustion of the day. Chloe walked down the short, carpeted hallway. Jinwoo was sitting at the kitchen table. He was still wearing his blue work polo, but he had unbuttoned the collar, and his shoulders were hunched forward so deeply that his chest nearly touched the edge of the table. A white ceramic bowl containing a half-eaten block of cold tofu sat in front of him, beside a half-empty bottle of soju. Unji was sitting on the low stool by the pantry, her hands resting on her knees. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face stripped of the manic energy she usually had when she was angry. She looked old. Under the harsh, flickering fluorescent tube of the kitchen ceiling, her skin had a gray, translucent quality. When Chloe entered, neither of them yelled. The screaming from the morning had expired, leaving only a heavy, sullen confusion in the room. "Where were you?" her mother asked. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, lacking the demanding bite of her previous calls. "We called and called. The phone was dead again?" "I was with Julian," Chloe said. She walked to the counter, took a clean glass from the drying rack, and filled it with tap water. The pipes made a loud, shuddering rattle behind the drywall as the water ran. "We were looking at furniture." Her father took a slow sip of his soju. He did not look at her. He stared at his cold tofu. "The inspector came back," Jinwoo said in Korean, his voice flat. "A different one. A white woman. She had 2 men with her in blue jackets. They put a red paper on the door. They used heavy tape. Your mother tried to scrape it off, but the woman said something about the police. He stopped, his fingers tracing the rim of his small glass. "Translate the paper," he commanded. It was not a shout. It was the quiet, desperate command of a man who was used to having his world translated, who believed that if Chloe just explained the words, the red paper would lose its power. "Tell us what we have to do." The white woman said, "Monday. What happens on Monday?" Chloe took a sip of her water. The coldness of the liquid traveled down her throat, settling like a heavy stone in her stomach. She knew exactly what would happen if she translated it. She would have to tell him that they had 20 hours to hire a technician, which would cost at least $2,000 in emergency fees. She would have to tell him that if they didn't, the business they had spent 22 years building would be locked by the city. She looked at her father's hunched shoulders. She looked at her mother's small red hands resting on her knees. For her entire life, Chloe had been the one to absorb the impact of their stubbornness, their pride, and their refusal to adapt. She had been the shock absorber. Every time they hit a wall, she was the one who went black and blue so they could keep moving forward. "I can't read it tonight," Chloe said, her voice steady and quiet. "My head hurts from the exam. I'll look at it tomorrow morning before I go to campus." Her father's hand tightened around his glass. "Tomorrow? Tomorrow is Friday, Minji. The shop opens at 7. If the paper says Monday, we only have tomorrow to fix it."
The city offices are closed on the weekend anyway,
Chloe said, setting her empty glass down on the counter with a quiet, decisive clack.
"There's nothing we can do tonight."
"Minji," her mother pleaded, her voice cracking slightly as she leaned forward from her stool. "Just look at the photo on your phone. Just tell us if we have to pay money. Your father has $500 left in the safe. Is that enough?" Chloe looked at her mother. She saw the fear in her eyes, the raw, naked terror of an immigrant who had spent her life running from the authorities, who believed that any official paper was a precursor to ruin. She felt a brief, faint prickle of the old guilt, the ancient instinct to crawl to her mother's knees and promise to make it all okay. But then she remembered the black ledger. She remembered the $35 she had paid out of her own pocket to the mechanic. She remembered the modular ash sofa she had touched today, the smell of clean pine, and the quiet, solid future she had spent 2 years building with Julian. A future that would be instantly devoured if she let herself be dragged back into the swamp of her parents' survival. "I'll look at it in the morning," Chloe said. She turned and walked out of the kitchen, her steps light and silent on the carpet. Behind her, her father did not shout. He did not slam his glass on the table. He simply poured another shot of soju, the clear liquid glugging softly in the dark, silent house. At 5:15 a.m. on Friday, the house was as silent as a tomb. The freezing fog from the night before had settled into a thick, white frost that coated the grass in tiny, brittle needles. Chloe stood in the center of her bedroom, her winter coat already on, holding a manila folder she had just retrieved from the bottom drawer of her desk. Inside the folder were the core documents of her existence: her birth certificate, her social security card, her passport, and the physical title to her 2008 Honda Civic. She had spent her teenage years keeping these documents in her parents' metal lockbox in their closet, but 3 months ago, when they had asked her to translate their mortgage refinancing paperwork, she had quietly slipped her own papers out and kept them in her room. She opened her canvas bag, sliding the manila folder deep into the main compartment, right behind her heavy accounting textbook. The paper citation from the county health department, the white one, rustled against the cardboard sleeve of her laptop. She took her phone out of her pocket. The battery was at 98%. She did not open her messaging apps. Instead, she opened her mobile banking application. She ran her thumb over the screen, logging in. Chloe Hahn, $84.12. Then she switched profiles to the joint business account, Hans Prestige Cleaners, LLC. Available balance, $3,412.18. Her name was listed as a joint owner and the primary authorized signer. When her father had registered the LLC in 2018 to shield their personal assets, the bank manager had explained that because Jin Woo had no established credit history in the United States and could not pass the basic English literacy verification for commercial accounts, they needed a co-signer with a valid Social Security number and domestic tax history. Chloe, who had just turned 18, had signed the documents in a sterile, fluorescent-lit office while her father stood behind her, nodding and smiling at the banker. For 8 years, she had been legally liable for every check written from that account. If her father ran a deficit, if he failed to pay his payroll taxes, or if the county sued the business for environmental violations, the financial shadow would fall directly on her. It would destroy her credit score, freeze her personal accounts, and make it impossible for her to pass the background check for the apartment she and Julian had just leased. She closed the app. Today was Friday. At 9 a.m., the local branch of Metro First Bank would open. She needed to be standing at the glass doors the moment they unlocked. Chloe picked up her bag, sling-loading the heavy strap over her shoulder. She stepped out of her bedroom, her feet silent on the carpeted landing. She descended the stairs one by one, avoiding the third step from the bottom, which always gave a loud wooden groan under pressure. The kitchen was cold, the air still smelling faintly of the sesame oil her mother had used the night before. On the laminate table, the half-empty bottle of soju sat beside the white bowl of cold tofu. The soy sauce had dried into a dark, sticky ring around the base of the ceramic. Beside the bowl lay the red paper her mother had photographed. Chloe stood by the table, looking down at the red sheet. The heavy black letters seemed to vibrate in the dim gray light of dawn. Immediate suspension of operating license, effective 8 a.m., Monday. She did not touch it. She did not translate it. She took a small yellow post-it note from the drawer by the telephone, wrote 3 words in Korean, "Gone to library," and stuck it to the edge of the dried soy sauce ring. It was a polite, empty shield, a message designed to give them a false sense of security for the next few hours, while she dismantled the scaffolding of her life. She quietly unlocked the front door, stepped out onto the frosty porch, and closed the door behind her until she heard the small, metallic click of the latch. The cold dawn air was incredibly sharp, entering her lungs like a draft of ice water. Her Civic was covered in a thick layer of white frost that made the windshield opaque. She did not start the engine immediately. She didn't want the noise to wake her parents in the front bedroom. She took a plastic scraper from the back seat and began to scrape the frost from the driver's side glass. The sound was loud in the quiet neighborhood, a rhythmic, harsh shur, shur, shur that sent tiny showers of ice crystals down onto her leather gloves. As she worked, her mind was perfectly clear, operating with the cold, linear logic of the accounting exam she had spent the week taking. If she removed her name from the business account today, her father would no longer be able to use her credit line for commercial transactions. He would have to go to the bank himself to sign any major documents, a process that would require him to use a certified translator, which would cost him money he didn't want to spend. And more importantly, when the county inspector arrived on Monday morning to place the padlock on the door, the legal liability for the non-compliance fines would fall solely on the LLC and her parents' personal assets. Her credit would remain clean. Her name would remain clear. She finished scraping the front windshield, leaving a clean, dark rectangle of glass through which she could see the cold blue sky of Friday morning. She got into the car, turned the key, and let the engine idle. The old Civic vibrated, its exhaust forming a thick white plume that drifted up into the bare branches of the juniper bushes. She backed out of the driveway slowly, her eyes on the dark front windows of the house. No lights came on, no curtains parted. The house remained silent, frozen in its own deep, stubborn sleep, entirely unaware that the air inside its walls was already beginning to thin. Chloe parked her Civic 3 doors down from the Metro First Bank branch, in front of an empty storefront with a faded "For Lease" sign taped to the glass. It was 8:48 a.m. The bank's interior lights were already on, casting a flat, white, fluorescent glow onto the heavy double-paned glass doors. But the closed sign remained facing outward. Through the window, she could see a teller in a gray vest slowly loading cash drawers into her station, her movements mechanical and unhurried. Chloe kept the engine idling to keep the heater blowing. The heat was dry and smelled faintly of dust, warming her face while her hands, still wrapped in her leather gloves, remained cold. She rested her head against the vinyl headrest, her eyes fixed on the digital clock on the dashboard. 8:52, 8:53. She remembered the day she had signed the papers for the LLC. It had been a hot Thursday in July, right after her 18th birthday. Her father had worn his only suit, a shiny polyester blend charcoal jacket that was too tight across his broad shoulders, and he had smelled of cheap tobacco and the peppermint gum he chewed to hide it. He had stood behind her chair in the branch manager's office, his hand heavy on her shoulder, pressing down with a pride that felt like iron. "My daughter," he had told the manager in his halting, heavy English, gesturing to her with a wide, dramatic sweep of his arm. "She go to university. She speak perfect. She sign." At 18, Chloe had felt a fierce, burning surge of validation. She had believed she was the savior of her family, the brilliant daughter who would lead them out of the cramped, grease-smelling world of the dry cleaners and into the clean, respected light of American commerce. She had signed her name on 3 different signature cards, her hand shaking with the weight of the responsibility. She had not understood then that her father wasn't giving her power, he was giving her his shadow. At exactly 9 a.m., the teller walked to the front of the bank, turned the lock with a heavy metallic clack, and flipped the sign to open. Chloe turned off her car, gathered her canvas bag, and stepped out into the freezing morning air. Her boots made a sharp, rhythmic sound on the cold concrete as she walked to the entrance. The lobby of Metro First Bank was warm and quiet, smelling of industrial carpet cleaner, stale coffee, and the sterile ozone of laser printers. A low, brass-trimmed barrier separated the teller line from the personal banking desks in the back. "Good morning," a personal banker said, rising from behind a mahogany desk. He was a young man, perhaps 25, with a neat blue tie and a silver name tag that read, "Marcus. How can I help you today?" "I need to remove myself from a commercial account," Chloe said. Her voice was low and calm, holding the quiet professional tone she had practiced during her mock accounting interviews at school. Marcus's smile remained polite, but his eyes flickered with a brief professional curiosity. "Are you an authorized signer or a joint owner?" "Both," she said. She reached into her bag, pulled out her manila folder, and set her driver's license, her social security card, and the LLC incorporation documents on the desk. "The account is under Hans Prestige Cleaners, LLC. I am the co-signer and joint owner." "I see," Marcus said, gesturing for her to sit in the low leather chair opposite him. He took her documents and began typing into his computer, the rapid click-clack of his keyboard the only sound in the quiet corner of the lobby. "Let me pull up the file." Chloe sat back, her hands folded in her lap. Her fingers were still slightly stiff from the cold, but she kept them perfectly still. "All right," Marcus said, looking at his monitor. "I see the account here. It was opened in 2018. The primary owner is Jin Woo Han, and you are listed as the joint owner and secondary guarantor. Is the business being restructured?" "No," Chloe said. "I am moving out of the area and will no longer be involved in the management or financial operations of the business. I need to be legally removed from all liabilities and signatory rights." Marcus tapped his pen against the edge of his desk, his brow furrowing slightly. "Typically, to remove a joint owner from a commercial account, we require both owners to be present to sign the modification agreement. Or we have to close the account and open a new one under the primary owner's sole name." Chloe had prepared for this. She had spent 3 hours the previous night researching Metro First Bank's commercial account terms and conditions online. "According to Section 14 of your commercial banking agreement," Chloe said, her voice remaining perfectly level, "a joint owner of an LLC account may unilaterally relinquish their ownership and signatory rights by submitting a formal relinquishment of liability form, provided they are not the sole guarantor of an outstanding commercial loan with the bank. The LLC has no active loans with Metro First. We only have a standard business checking account with a commercial line of credit." Marcus stopped tapping his pen. He looked at her, his eyes widening slightly, before he turned back to his screen. He scrolled down a page, read silently for a moment, and then cleared his throat. "You're correct," he said, his tone shifting from polite routine to a quiet, professional respect. "I apologize. It's an uncommon request. Most families just close the account together. Give me 1 moment to print the relinquishment of signatory and ownership rights form." He walked to the printer behind his desk. Chloe looked at the mahogany surface of the desk. In the center sat a small, blue ink plastic pen with Metro First printed in gold on the barrel. She calculated the sequence of events that would follow her signature. Once she signed this form, her Social Security number would be unlinked from the business. But more importantly, the $5,000 commercial line of credit attached to the checking account, which was approved solely based on her personal credit score and tax history, would be automatically revoked. The bank's automated system would flag the change by midnight. Without her credit backing the account, Han's Prestige Cleaners would be restricted to a standard, non-overdraft checking account. And if her father wrote a check to Dave the mechanic today, or if the county attempted to draft the environmental compliance fee from the account next week, and the balance dropped even $1 below zero, the transaction would not clear. The check would bounce. The account would lock. "Here we go," Marcus said, returning with a single sheet of cream-colored paper. He laid it on the desk and pushed the blue pen toward her. "Please read through the highlighted sections. By signing here, you are permanently forfeiting all rights to the funds in the account, and you are releasing yourself from any future legal or financial liability associated with Han's Prestige Cleaners, LLC, effective immediately." Chloe picked up the pen. The plastic barrel was light and slightly warm from the desk lamp. She did not hesitate. She signed her name on the bottom line, Chloe Han, her handwriting neat, vertical, and perfectly clear. The interior of the Honda Civic was freezing again, the dashboard heater having lost its fight against the morning air the moment she had turned off the key. Chloe sat in the driver's seat, the heavy door closed against the quiet street. She opened her canvas bag, slid her hands inside, and carefully tucked the cream-colored bank receipt, stamped with the morning's date and the word "processed" in blue ink, into the manila folder. The folder was growing thick, a paper shield between her future and the ruin behind her. She pulled her phone from her coat pocket and turned it on. The screen flashed, its cold light reflecting in her eyes. The notifications arrived in a sudden, silent wave. A text from her mother, sent at 9:12 a.m. The city woman came back. She had a man with a camera. They took photos of the front door. Your father went out and shouted at them. They didn't listen. Minji, why are you doing this? Where are you? Come back. A text from Julian, sent at 9:15 a.m. Just got the email from the leasing office. They've approved our income verification and the co-signer release for your parents. We are officially on our own lease now. I'm signing my part digitally. Let me know when you sign yours. And a text from Mr. Kim, the commercial sales representative for Northern Chemical Supplies, the distributor that provided the dry cleaning solvents and detergents for Han's Prestige Cleaners. It had been sent at 9:18 a.m. Hi, Chloe. We tried to process check number 408 for the solvent shipment we delivered on Tuesday, but Metro First Bank just called us. They said the business line of credit has been restricted and the check is flagged for insufficient funds. Can you call the branch and authorize the overdraft protection? We need this cleared today or we have to pause next week's delivery. Thanks, Kim. Chloe stared at Mr. Kim's message. Check number 408. She remembered her father writing it on Tuesday morning, his broad, heavy hand holding a cheap plastic pen, his brow furrowed as he carefully copied the numbers she had written down on a scrap piece of cardboard. The check was for $850, the cost of 2 drums of high-grade perchloroethylene. Usually, when the checking account balance was low, the bank's commercial overdraft system would automatically pull from the $5,000 line of credit Chloe had co-signed for. The check would clear, the solvent would be delivered, and Chloe would spend the next 3 days carefully moving tutoring money or cash from the register into the bank to cover the gap before any interest accrued. But now she was no longer a joint owner. The line of credit was gone. The overdraft shield had dissolved the moment her signature dried on Marcus's cream-colored form. She did not call the branch. She did not call Mr. Kim. She tapped her screen, opening her contact list, and found Mr. Kim's name. "Hi, Mr. Kim," she typed, her thumbs moving with a slow, deliberate precision. "I am no longer an authorized signer or joint owner of the Han's Prestige Cleaners account. I cannot authorize any overdraft protection or fund transfers. You will need to contact my father, Jin-Woo Han, directly to resolve the payment. His number is still the same. Thank you, Chloe." She hit send. The text bubble turned blue, the small progress bar at the top of the screen sliding to the right before disappearing with a quiet, metallic swoosh. It was done. Mr. Kim had been doing business with the Han family for 7 years, but he had never spoken to Jin-Woo Han for more than 30 seconds. Every order, every invoice dispute, every delivery schedule had been negotiated through Chloe's voice. When Jin-Woo tried to talk to him, he would get frustrated, his English dissolving into loud, defensive Korean phrases that made Mr. Kim uncomfortable. Without her voice, the connection between Han's Prestige Cleaners and its primary chemical supplier was now a broken wire, sparking in the dark. Chloe opened her mobile banking application. She went to her personal checking account. Balance, $84.12. She opened her Venmo account. She had $350 sitting in her balance, the payment she had received yesterday from the parents of the high school sophomore she tutored in advanced algebra. She had kept it there, holding it like a secret reserve. She tapped the screen, initiating an instant transfer of the entire $350 to her Metro First checking account. The screen spun a small white loading circle for 2 seconds before a green checkmark appeared. Transfer complete. She went back to her banking app and refreshed the screen. Chloe Han, $434.12. It was not a large number. It was not enough to buy the modular ash sofa Julian had liked, or to pay for a week of dinners at Le Petit Hibou. But it was her money. It was clean money, earned by her own mind, stored in an account that her father's name could no longer touch. She lowered the phone, resting her hands on the cold vinyl steering wheel. The condensation from her breath was starting to form a thin gray mist on the inside of the windshield, slowly erasing the view of the quiet suburban street. Through the fog, the empty storefront across the road looked like a ghost, its "For Lease" sign a pale white square in the dim light. Today was Friday. The county inspector's deadline was exactly 7 hours and 40 minutes away. At 5 p.m., the gate would swing shut. Her parents would open the shop tomorrow morning, Saturday, believing that because Chloe had always made the bad papers go away, she would make this one go away too. They would run the steam presses, they would hang the shirts, and they would wait for her to walk through the back door with her canvas bag and her polite, quiet voice, ready to fix the world. But Chloe was not going to the shop. She put the car in gear, her tires making a soft, wet crunch against the cold asphalt as she pulled away from the curb, heading toward the highway that led to campus. The Student Union coffee shop was warm and filled with the low, gentle rumble of acoustic guitar music drifting from the ceiling speakers. The air smelled of dark roasted coffee beans, cinnamon pastries, and the clean, damp wool of students' coats drying in the indoor heat. Chloe sat at a small oak table near the back corner, away from the glass entrance. A half-empty ceramic mug of black coffee sat beside her laptop, its steam having long since faded into a thin, transparent film that coated the dark liquid. Her fingers hovered over her laptop trackpad. On the screen was the resident portal for the Meridian, the new brick apartment building 4 blocks from the university. The web page was clean, white, and divided into neat gray columns. At the center of the screen was a PDF document. Residential Lease Agreement, Unit 4B. Julian had already signed his portion. His digital signature, Julian Vance, sat on the first line in a crisp, blue cursive font, stamped with the exact date and time of his execution. Friday, 9:15 a.m. Below his name was her line. Co-tenant, Chloe Min-ji Han. Chloe clicked the small yellow box next to her name. A prompt popped up asking her to verify her identity by entering her social security number and checking a box to confirm she understood the legal binding of the contract. She typed the numbers slowly, her fingers making a quiet, rhythmic clack, clack, clack on the keyboard. She looked at the digital floor plan attached to the end of the lease. Unit 4B was exactly 642 square feet. It had a single bedroom, a small kitchen alcove with a slate countertop, and a living area with a wide bay window that looked out over the city park. She had spent her entire life in her parents' house, where her physical space was never entirely her own. Her childhood bedroom had always been treated as an overflow storage room for the dry cleaners. The closet was packed with boxes of extra-strength wire hangers, plastic collar stays, and white cardboard shirt boards that smelled of dry cleaning fluid. Every time her father ran out of storage at the shop, he would bring home 3 or 4 heavy cardboard boxes and stack them against her bedroom wall, telling her in Korean, "It's just for a few days, Min-ji. We don't have room in the back office." The boxes always stayed. The smell of chemical starch had settled deep into her bedsheets, her clothes, and her hair, a permanent olfactory reminder that her life was merely a utility closet for Han's prestige cleaners. In Unit 4B, there would be no boxes of hangers, no wire racks, no chemical smells. There was no space in that 642-square-foot floor plan for anyone other than herself and Julian. The geometry of the apartment was an absolute boundary, a physical wall that her family's chaos could not penetrate. She clicked the final button, Submit Document. The page spun a small white circle before refreshing into a solid green screen. Document fully executed. Congratulations on your new home. Chloe closed her laptop. The quiet hum of the processor died away, leaving only the soft acoustic music in the background. She picked up her phone. There was a new text message from her mother, sent at 11:22 a.m. It was a long, frantic paragraph, written in broken Korean with dozens of typos that showed how quickly Eunji's fingers had been shaking. Mr. Kim from Northern Chemical called. He said you are not on the account anymore. He said the check is bad. He said we have no credit. Your father is screaming. He said you did something to the bank. What did you do, Minji? Your father is going to the bank now. He is going to talk to the manager. You must call us. The bank is going to take our money. Chloe read the message twice. She could picture her father, his face purple with rage, storming into the local Metro First Bank branch in his dirty work polo, his hands shaking as he demanded to see the manager. He would stand at the teller line, shouting in loud, fragmented English, trying to explain that his daughter was a thief who had ruined his business. But the bank manager would not be able to help him. The bank manager would look at the system and explain that Chloe Han had legally relinquished her joint ownership of the account, as was her right under the commercial terms. They would tell him that because Chloe's credit was no longer backing the account, the $5,000 commercial line of credit had been closed. And if Jinwoo wanted to open a new line of credit, he would have to submit 3 years of certified personal tax returns, returns that Chloe had not filed for him because he had refused to disclose his cash-only contracts. Without her, her father was legally and financially blind, standing in the middle of a glass lobby, shouting at people who could not understand him. She set her phone face down on the wooden table. She picked up her ceramic mug and took a slow, bitter sip of her cold black coffee. The liquid was flat and dark, but it was quiet. It sat in her stomach like an anchor, holding her in this warm, clean corner of the student union while the storm raged 3 miles away. Today was Friday. It was 11:42 a.m. The county health department's deadline was exactly 5 hours and 18 minutes away. By 5 p.m., the pink paper on the microwave and the red paper on the front door of Han's Prestige Cleaners would turn into a lock. And for the first time in her life, Chloe Han did not care. The United States Post Office near the edge of campus was a low brick building with high, narrow windows that let in only a pale gray wash of afternoon light. It smelled of wet cardboard, dusty canvas mailbags, and the sharp chemical tang of fresh packaging tape. Chloe stood at one of the tall, standing-height wooden writing desks in the center of the lobby. A heavy black ballpoint pen was chained to the desk's brass trim by a small beaded steel wire that clinked softly against the wood as she moved her hand. She was filling out a yellow and white paper change of address form. She could have completed the process online in 30 seconds, but there was a physical weight to the paper that she wanted to feel. She wrote her full legal name on the first line, Chloe Min-ji Han, her letters small and precise, fitting perfectly within the boxes. Old address, 142 Riverview Drive. New address, 402 Elm Street, Unit 4B. Effective date, 1st of the month. She pressed down hard with the pen, the ballpoint tearing slightly into the cheap, recycled paper of the form. The carbon copy underneath turned a deep, bruised purple, duplicating her signature on the duplicate sheet below. This was the final thread. For 22 years, every piece of mail bearing her name had arrived at her parents' house. Her university tuition statements, her tax documents, her bank disclosures, and her medical bills had all been sorted by her mother's hands at the kitchen counter. Her parents had always viewed her mail not as private correspondence, but as joint household property, something to be opened, translated, and logged into the family's collective ledger of debts and obligations. By changing her address, she was rerouting the physical proof of her existence. Her paper trail would no longer lead to the small, yellow-sided ranch house on Riverview Drive. It would flow to Unit 4B behind a locked metal mailbox that only she and Julian had the key to. She tore the yellow copy of the form along its perforated edge, folded it twice, and slid it into her coat pocket. She dropped the white original into the brass slot marked "Official Mail Only." It fell with a soft, dry paper rustle into the dark bin below. As she stepped out of the post office lobby, her phone vibrated in her pocket. It was a voicemail notification. She walked to her Civic, got into the cold driver's seat, and closed the door. The gravel under her tires made a soft, wet crunch as she adjusted her weight. She opened her phone and pressed the voicemail icon. Her father's voice came through the speaker, distorted and tinny, but carrying a heavy, ragged rasp that she had never heard before. He was speaking in Korean, his sentences fragmented, his pride struggling against a creeping, desperate panic. "Minji," Jinwoo said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly mumble before rising sharply. "The bank, they are crazy. They say you are not on the paper anymore. They say the line is 0. I cannot pay Northern. I cannot pay Dave. Dave has the van. He won't bring it back unless we pay cash. $500. But we don't have the cash because of the Gable woman. Minji, you must come. The bank manager is a young white boy. He won't listen to me. He says to call you. You call him. Call him now. Tell him to fix the line." There was a brief pause on the recording, the sound of her father taking a heavy, wet breath, followed by her mother's voice in the background, sharp and frantic, shouting about the city inspector. "They are coming back on Monday," her father continued, his tone shifting into a desperate command. "The inspector woman, you must call her. Tell her we are fixing the machine. Tell her we need more time. Minji, call the bank. Call Dave. We are waiting for you at the shop." The recording clicked off, replaced by the mechanical, cheerful voice of the automated system. To delete this message, press 7. To save, Chloe pressed 7. The voicemail disappeared, deleted from the server, erased from the digital memory of her device. She sat in the quiet cabin of her car, her hands resting on her lap. Her palm was slightly indented where the beaded wire of the post office pen had pressed against her skin. She looked at the digital clock on her dashboard. 2:44 p.m. Today was Friday. The county health department's deadline was exactly 2 hours and 16 minutes away. At 5 p.m., the office downtown would close for the weekend. The computers would log the non-compliance status of Han's Prestige Cleaners LLC, and the system would automatically generate the formal suspension order for Monday morning. Her father had tried to use his usual tools, his physical pain, his anger, and his loud, desperate commands, to force her back into the harness. He still believed that if he shouted loud enough, the magic of her voice would repair the broken gears of his world. He didn't understand that the gears weren't just broken, they were gone. She had unlinked her name from the business. She had rerouted her mail. She had signed the lease on Unit 4B. and she had left Mr. Kim's solvent shipment sitting in the distributor's warehouse, unpaid and unreleased. She reached down, took her phone, and switched it off once more. The screen turned black, reflecting the cold, gray sky of Friday afternoon. She put the phone into her bag, pulled her keys from her pocket, and started the engine. The old Civic caught with its usual wet whine, settling into its vibrating idle. She pulled out of the post office parking lot, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She was not driving toward the shop on the commercial strip, nor was she driving to the house on Riverview Drive. She was driving to Julian's studio apartment, where her first cardboard box of clothes, already packed and taped, was waiting for her on his small, clean kitchen table. At 4:59 p.m., Chloe sat on a low wooden stool in Julian's studio apartment, her hands resting on the edge of a medium-sized cardboard box. Beside her, the microwave on the kitchen counter gave a soft, high-pitched beep as the digital clock clicked over. 5 p.m. The county health department office downtown was now closed. The digital portal for environmental compliance had locked its submission queue for the week. The red paper taped to the front door of Hans Prestige Cleaners was no longer a warning. It was a completed, legal transaction. Chloe let out a long, slow breath. The air in Julian's apartment was warm and dry, smelling faintly of the lavender detergent he used and the clean, dusty cardboard of the boxes they had been taping. "That's the last of the kitchen stuff," Julian said, walking in from his small balcony. He was carrying a roll of thick brown packing tape. He stopped, looking down at her, his expression warm but searching. "You've been staring at that box for 10 minutes. Are you sure you don't want to turn your phone back on? Just to make sure they haven't called the police or something?" "They won't call the police," Chloe said. Her voice was quiet, almost flat. "The police can't fix a bank account." "I just don't want them showing up at the new place once we move," Julian said, leaning against the counter. He pulled the tape from the roll, the sharp screech of the adhesive tearing through the quiet apartment like a rip in fabric. "We need to make sure they understand this is a hard boundary, Chloe. No more middle-of-the-night emergency bookkeeping." "They won't know the new address," Chloe said. "I set up mail forwarding today. It goes to a post office box first." "Good," Julian said, nodding approvingly. "That's smart." Before she could reply, a sudden heavy thud vibrated through the floorboards. It was not a knock. It was a violent, rhythmic slamming against the heavy wood of Julian's front door. 3 rapid, frantic blows that made the brass deadbolt rattle in its strike plate. Chloe's body went completely still. Her hands, still resting on the cardboard box, tightened until her knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. Julian frowned, his head snapping toward the door. "Who the hell is that?" He walked toward the entryway. Through the narrow hallway, Chloe could see the shadow of 2 figures blocking the yellow light of the peephole. "Julian, don't," Chloe said. Her voice was low, but it held a sharp, icy clarity that made him freeze with his hand 3 inches from the brass doorknob. "Chloe?" Julian turned back, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Is it them?" Before she could answer, the slamming returned, louder this time. A fist pounded against the wood, followed by a sharp, metallic scratching sound, the sound of someone trying to force the handle down. "Minji!" Her mother's voice came through the door, high-pitched, thin and raspy, with a desperate, wild fury. It didn't sound like the voice of a mother. It sounded like a dying animal clawing at a cage. "Minji! Open the door. We know you are in there. Your car is outside. Open the door!" Julian looked at Chloe, his face turning pale. He had never heard Eunji Han speak with this kind of raw, uncontrolled violence. In the few polite dinners they had shared, her mother had been a quiet, nodding presence, smiling, of course, and offering him small plates of cut fruit. "Chloe, "I'm opening it," Julian whispered, his voice tense. "We can't just let them break the door down. This is an apartment building." He turned the lock. The brass deadbolt gave a loud, heavy clack as it disengaged. The door was pushed open instantly, flying back until it struck the drywall behind it with a dull, hollow thud. Eunji Han stood in the doorway. Her hair, usually pinned back in a neat bun, was damp from the cold drizzle and falling in thin, gray-streaked strands across her face. She was wearing her dirty work apron over her coat, the front stained with grease and a dark, dried smear of soy sauce from the morning's kitchen table. Her face was distorted, her mouth open in a trembling, white-lipped snarl. Behind her, standing in the carpeted hallway like a dark, heavy monolith, was Jin Woo. He was leaning heavily against the doorframe, his face a dark, mottled purple, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged gasps. He looked smaller than he had yesterday, his shoulders hunched so deeply that his blue work polo seemed to hang off him like a wet sack. Eunji did not look at Julian. She pushed past him, her wet boots leaving a dark, muddy smear across the clean, polished oak of his entryway floor. "Min-ji!" her mother screamed in Korean, her voice echoing off the narrow walls of the studio. She pointed a trembling, red-skinned finger at Chloe, who remained sitting on the low wooden stool. "You ungrateful, evil girl! You traitor! Look at your father! Look at what you did to him!" Julian stepped between them, his hands raised in a polite, defensive gesture. "Mrs. Han, please. You can't just push your way in here. We need to calm down." Eunji didn't even look at his face. She shoved his arm away with a sudden, surprising strength born of pure panic. "Get out of the way!" she shouted in broken, heavily accented English, before snapping back into furious, rapid-fire Korean directed entirely at Chloe. "You think you can run away? You think you can leave us with nothing? The chemical company canceled our delivery. Dave won't give the van back. The bank boy told your father that the account is empty because of you. What did you do to the money? Where is our money?" Chloe sat perfectly still. She did not rise from her stool. She did not raise her hands to shield herself from her mother's shaking finger. Her mind, cold and analytical, ran the calculation. Her mother was speaking in Korean because she knew Julian couldn't understand the words. She was using the language as a weapon, a private chamber of violence where she could berate her daughter without the shame of Julian witnessing the ugly, raw details of their financial ruin. She wanted to drag Chloe back into the familiar, suffocating dark of their cultural guilt, using Julian's presence as a stage to show her how much she had destroyed. "The money is in the safe," Chloe said. Her voice was incredibly quiet, sitting far below her mother's high, frantic screams. She spoke in Korean, her tone flat and empty of any vibration. "And the bank account is not empty. The $3,000 is still there. You just don't have the line of credit anymore." "You killed the business!" her mother shrieked, her face twisting into a mask of pure hatred. She stepped closer, her wet apron brushing against the cardboard box Chloe had just taped. "Your father worked 30 years for you. We sacrificed our entire lives so you could go to school and learn English. And you use your English to steal our name? You ungrateful dog. You are a traitor to your own blood." Behind them, Jin Woo took a slow, heavy step into the room, his wet boots leaving a second trail of gray mud on the clean wood. He looked at Chloe, his eyes small, dark, and filled with a cold, silent fury that felt heavier than any of her mother's screams. The air in the small studio apartment felt physically crowded, compressed by the heavy, sour smell of her parents' wet clothes and the sharp, medicinal burn of her father's menthol pain patches. Chloe's mother, Unji, stood less than 3 feet from the cardboard box. Her hands, rough and white-crusted from dry cleaning chemicals, with cuticles split into tiny, raw red lines, were trembling violently. She reached out, her fingers catching the edge of the brown packing tape Chloe had just applied. She didn't tear it, she just clawed at it, her fingernails leaving gray, dirty scratches on the clean surface of the cardboard. "Chloe," Julian said, his voice tight with a rising, defensive panic. He took another step forward, his shoulder brushing against her father's wet coat. "What is she saying? Tell me what she is saying right now." Chloe did not look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on her mother's shaking hands. If she translated her mother's words, she would have to say, "She is calling me a dog. She is saying my blood belongs to them. She is saying that every dollar I saved from my tutoring was stolen from their sweat." But she calculated the cost of that translation. To translate was to perform her old duty. To translate was to act as the interpreter of her own execution, to soften the blows so Julian wouldn't be too shocked, to make her parents' ugly, raw fury presentable to a white man in a wool sweater. She refused. She chose silence. She wanted Julian to hear the unfiltered, jagged rhythm of their anger. She wanted him to feel the suffocating weight of the language he couldn't understand, the sheer, violent pressure of a heritage that treated a daughter as an unpaid resource. "Minji!" Unji screamed again, her voice cracking as she took a half-step closer. A tiny drop of saliva flew from her lips, landing on the matte brown surface of the box. "You think this white boy will protect you? You think you are one of them now? He looks at you and sees a cheap girl who will clean his house and do his papers. When he is tired of you, he will throw you in the street like garbage. You are Korean. Your father's blood is in your veins. You owe us your life." The cultural weapon was old, heavy, and blunt. It was the same threat they had used when she wanted to go to an out-of-state university. The same threat they used when she wanted to take a summer internship instead of working 80 hours at the counter for free. You owe us your life. It was a debt that could never be settled, a mortgage on her very existence that her parents adjusted whenever she tried to claim a single hour of her own time. Julian looked at Chloe's face, his eyes searching hers for some sign of distress, some cue to intervene. "Mrs. Hahn, I don't know what you are saying, but you need to back up," he said, his voice rising, dropping its polite restraint. He put his hand on the box, physically blocking Unji from touching it again. "You are trespassing. This is my apartment. If you don't step back, I am calling the building manager." Jin-Woo Han took a slow, heavy step forward. The wet soles of his boots made a sharp, rubbery squeak on the polished oak floorboards. He did not look at Julian. He looked down at Chloe, his face dark, his small, bloodshot eyes nearly hidden beneath the deep, swollen folds of his brow. He did not shout. When he spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly vibration that sat beneath his wife's high-pitched shrieks, carrying the heavy, undisputed weight of a patriarch who had never been questioned in his own house. "Come back to the house," her father said in Korean. "Pack your clothes. Dave has the van, and the city will lock the doors on Monday. You will call the bank manager tomorrow morning. You will tell him you made a mistake. You will write the letter to the city inspector. If you do not do this," he paused. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in the corner was the only sound in the room. Outside, A sudden gust of wind sent a spray of rain against the glass of the balcony door, a soft, scratching rattle like fingernails on glass. "If you do not do this," Jinwoo repeated, his voice cold and perfectly flat, "you are no longer my daughter. You do not use our name. You do not come to our house. You are dead to us." The threat of disownment. In their world, it was the ultimate sentence, the final trapdoor. They believed that the fear of being cast out, of being left alone in a cold, white country without the protective shield of her family's name, would make her knees buckle. They believed that the weight of her ancestors, of the sacrifices they had made in Incheon and Seoul, would pull her down to the floor to beg for their forgiveness. Chloe looked at her father's face. She looked at the yellowed collar of his white t-shirt under his blue polo, damp with sweat. She looked at the red, swollen knuckles of his right hand, which had spent 30 years holding a heavy steam iron to feed a daughter they now called a dog. She felt no fear. She felt no sudden, burning surge of grief. She felt only the cold, dry clarity of an accountant looking at a ledger that had been closed for years. They had already cast her out. They had cast her out every time they made her pay their debts, every time they ignored her exhaustion, every time they used her voice to shield themselves from their own incompetence. She had already been disowned. She had just been the last one to sign the paper. "My name is Chloe," she said. She spoke in English, her voice quiet, steady, and perfectly clear in the warm, dry air of the apartment. Her parents stared at her, her mother's mouth opened slightly, her face frozen in a look of stunned, ugly confusion as the English letters hung in the silence between them. The English word, Chloe, hung in the warm, dry air of the studio like a cold draft. Her mother, Eun-ji, blinked. Her mouth remained slightly open, her face freezing into a look of stunned, ugly confusion. She looked at her daughter's face, then at the cardboard box, and then at Julian, as if searching for a translation of a word she had heard 1,000 times, but had never expected to find here, in this room, standing between them. "What are you saying?" her mother snapped in Korean, her voice dropping its high, frantic pitch and replacing it with a sudden, uneasy tremor. "Speaking Korean. Why are you speaking to me in English? Have you lost your mind?" Chloe slowly stood up from the low wooden stool. The movement was deliberate, smooth, and entirely devoid of the frantic, trembling panic that filled her mother's frame. Her knees did not shake, her shoulders did not hunch. She smoothed the front of her black, oversized sweater with both hands, her palms sliding down the wool fabric in a quiet, rhythmic gesture. She looked at her father. Jinwoo's bloodshot eyes were fixed on her. He had not moved, but the dark, mottled purple on his neck had begun to fade, leaving his skin a sickly, grayish-pale color. He understood more English than his wife did. He had heard the words, "My name is Chloe," and he had felt the quiet, clinical finality with which she had spoken them. "I am not coming back to the house," Chloe said. She spoke in English, her voice pitched low, her pronunciation clear and measured. She looked directly into her father's eyes. "I signed the lease for my new apartment today. I changed my address with the post office. My name is off the business bank account. The commercial line of credit is closed." She paused. The absolute silence in the room was immense, broken only by the quiet tick, tick, tick of the microwave clock on the counter. "Min-ji," her mother shouted, stepping closer, her hand reaching out to grab Chloe's arm. Her rough fingers caught the sleeve of Chloe's sweater, her grip tight and desperate. "What are you saying? What is she saying, Jinwoo? Tell her to stop speaking like that." Jinwoo did not answer his wife. He did not look at her. His eyes remained fixed on Chloe, his chest rising and falling in shallow, heavy wheezes. For 30 years he had been the master of his small, steam-choked kingdom. He had used his silence and his anger as iron tools, molding his family to fit the shape of his needs. But now, looking at his daughter's calm, level gaze, he felt a cold, sudden prickle of real panic. He realized she wasn't bluffing. This was not a tantrum. This was not the dramatic, tearful rebellion of a child who wanted validation or an apology. It was a completed transaction. The legal and financial lines had already been redrawn, and he had been left on the other side of the ledger, completely bankrupt of any leverage. The line, Jean Wu whispered in broken, fragmented English, his voice cracking. He took a half-step forward, his hand rising in a small, weak gesture that held none of his previous force. The line, closed? How? You sign, you are joint. I signed the relinquishment form at 9 o'clock this morning, Chloe said. She did not pull her arm away from her mother's grip. She let Eunji hold the wool of her sleeve, a dead weight that had no power over her. The bank processed it. I am no longer an owner. I am no longer a guarantor. If the checks bounce, it is your problem. Eunji looked at her husband's face, seeing the sudden gray terror there. The panic caught her instantly, her grip on Chloe's sleeve tightening until her knuckles turned red. What did she do? Eunji screamed in Korean, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical sob. Jinwoo, what did she do to the bank? Is the money gone? Where is our money? The $3,000 is still there, Chloe said in Korean, her voice remaining perfectly level, almost academic. But without my credit, you cannot pay Northern Chemical. You cannot pay Dave to get the van back. And the city inspector's deadline was at 5 o'clock. In 3 days, they will put the lock on the door. She looked at her mother's wet, distorted face. You told me I am dead to you, Chloe said softly. You told me I am no longer your daughter, so I am leaving. You don't have to worry about an ungrateful dog anymore. With a slow, gentle pressure, Chloe raised her arm. She did not struggle. She simply peeled her mother's rough, chemical-burned fingers from her sleeve, wire by wire, until her arm was free. Eunji's hand fell to her side, limp and useless. She looked at her empty palm, then up at Chloe, her face twisting into a silent, weeping grimace of absolute defeat. She had spent her entire life using the threat of her own suffering as a weapon, believing that her tears were an infinite resource that could always pull her daughter back into the harness. Now her tears were just water, falling onto the clean, polished wood of Julian's floor. Chloe reached down and picked up her canvas bag from the floor. She slipped the heavy strap over her shoulder, her fingers tracing the rough, durable canvas. She did not look at the cardboard boxes. She did not look at the kitchen table. She walked past her mother. She walked past her father, whose hunched shoulders seemed to shrink even further as she brushed by his wet, tobacco-smelling coat. Chloe, Julian said, his voice quiet and filled with a deep, breathless awe as he watched her. He walked to her side, his hand finding her waist, his touch warm and solid in the cold, silent hallway. Let's go, Chloe said. She did not look back. She opened the front door, stepped out into the carpeted hallway of the apartment building, and walked toward the elevator. Behind her, in the small, warm studio, the sound of her mother's sudden, quiet wailing began to rise, a thin, mournful sound that was quickly cut short as the heavy wooden door clicked shut. The Blue Star Diner sat on the edge of the commercial strip, its flickering pink and blue neon sign casting a long, trembling reflection across the rain-slicked asphalt of the empty parking lot. Inside, the air was warm, smelling of burnt onions, stale filter coffee, and the faint, sweet trace of maple syrup that seemed to have soaked permanently into the wood of the booths. It was 8:42 p.m. Chloe sat in a corner booth, her hands wrapped around a heavy, white ceramic mug of hot water. She had not ordered tea or coffee. She just wanted the clean, simple heat of the water, warming her palms through the thick porcelain. Outside, the cold autumn drizzle had turned into a wet, heavy sleet that struck the window pane with a soft, rhythmic tick, tick, clink. Through the glass, the streetlights looked like pale, watery halos in the dark. Julian sat opposite her. He had ordered a plate of eggs and hash browns, but he had barely touched it. He sat with his hands folded on the table, his eyes fixed on her face, his expression a quiet, suspended mixture of awe, confusion, and a lingering, protective worry. "They left," Julian said. His voice was low, barely louder than the hum of the diner's old refrigerator. "I called the building manager from the lobby while you were in the elevator. He said they stood in the hallway for about 10 minutes after we left. Your mother was sitting on the stairs. He told them they had to leave or he'd call the police. They got into their car and drove away." Chloe took a slow sip of the hot water. The heat traveled down her chest, quiet and clean. "They won't come back there," she said. "How are you so calm?" Julian asked, leaning forward, his brow furrowed, his fingers tightening against his knuckles. "Chloe, I've never seen anyone the way your father looked at you. And the bank. What did you mean when you said the line of credit was closed? Did you really take your name off?" "Yes," she said. "But how will they run the shop?" Chloe looked at the dark window, watching a single heavy drop of sleet slide down the glass, cutting a clear path through the gray road grime. "They won't," she said. The mathematical reality of their collapse was simple. She had run the numbers in her head 1,000 times over the last 48 hours, and the equations always yielded the same result. On Saturday morning, tomorrow, the shop would open at 7 a.m. Her father would arrive in his dirty work polo, turn on the boilers, and wait for the steam presses to heat up. He would wait for the first customer to walk through the door with a basket of dirty clothes. But there would be no clean hangers. The local packaging supplier, who had been burnt by her father's late payments twice last year, had only continued to deliver because Chloe had personally called the owner's daughter to apologize and authorize an automatic debit. Without her to authorize the transfer, the delivery would not arrive. The chemical supplier, Northern Chemical, would not release the solvent drums because the $850 check had bounced and the commercial line of credit was frozen. And the delivery van was sitting in Dave's garage. Dave would not release the keys until he was handed $500 in cash. Cash her father did not have, because he had given his last reserve to Mrs. Gable to keep her from calling the police. Without hangers, without chemicals, and without a van, the shop was no longer a business. It was just a cold room filled with wet, dirty clothes and an old, leaking machine that her father did not know how to maintain. "What did she mean about the $500? Julian asked, his voice gentle, trying to piece together the fragments of the Korean sentences he had heard. "And the traitor part?" "She thinks my life belongs to them," Chloe said. She set her mug down on the table, the ceramic making a quiet, solid clack against the laminated wood. "She thinks that because they paid for my food and my bed when I was a child, I am their property. She thinks my voice is something they own." She looked at Julian's clean, neat face. He was a good man. He loved her, and he wanted to protect her. But he had been born into a world where parents paid for college because they wanted their children to succeed, where boundaries were discussed in polite, therapeutic terms over dinner, and where a bank account was just a tool, not a weapon. He could never truly understand the absolute, suffocating terror of a family that viewed your independence as a theft. "You're free now," Julian said, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his. His palm was warm and dry, his fingers sliding between hers with a gentle, reassuring pressure. "We have the new place. The lease is signed. You don't ever have to go back there." "I know," Chloe said. She pulled her hand back gently, using the movement to pick up her mug again. She didn't want to be held. She didn't want to be comforted or celebrated. The freedom she felt was not a warm, joyful thing. It was a cold, heavy weight, like a sheet of iron that had been forged in a fire and then left to cool in the snow. She looked at her phone, which lay face down on the table beside her mug. It was still turned off. She calculated the progress of the night. By now, her parents would be back in the yellow-sided house on Riverview Drive. Her father would be sitting at the kitchen table, the bottle of soju empty, staring at the red paper she had refused to translate. Her mother would be pacing the linoleum floor, her red, chemical-burned hands twisting her dirty apron, waiting for the phone to ring. They would still believe that Chloe's silence was a phase, a temporary fit of anger that would dissolve by morning. They would believe that when the reality of their ruin became too loud, Chloe's guilt would drag her back to the front counter to save them. But as Chloe took another sip of her hot water, she knew she was already gone. She had deleted the voicemail. She had closed the ledger. And on Monday morning, when the city inspectors arrived with the heavy steel chains and the padlocks, the only voice her parents would hear would be their own, shouting into an empty room. Saturday morning brought a cold, fragile clarity. The sleet from the night before had washed the air clean, leaving the sky a pale, hard blue that filled Julian's studio apartment with a sharp, silver light. Chloe stood in the small, white-tiled bathroom. She was slowly squeezing a thin line of blue gel toothpaste onto her toothbrush, her movements quiet and unhurried. The bathroom was warm, smelling faintly of Julian's eucalyptus soap and the clean, damp steam of his morning shower. She looked at her reflection in the small, silver-framed mirror above the sink. Her face looked pale, the dark circles under her eyes still visible in the raw morning light. But her shoulders were level. The tight, defensive knot that had lived in the center of her chest for 10 years, a physical weight that usually made her morning breath feel shallow and restricted, had disappeared. She brushed her teeth, rinsed her mouth with cold water, and wiped her face with a soft, gray hand towel that belonged to Julian. It smelled of lavender and clean cedar. She walked out into the main room. Julian was in the kitchen alcove, standing by the small stainless steel kettle. The quiet, rhythmic shh of the water heating up was the only sound in the room. He had already set out 2 clean ceramic mugs, a jar of honey, and a small plate of toasted sourdough bread. "Good morning," Julian said, turning to look at her. His face was relaxed, his eyes holding a quiet, gentle warmth. "How did you sleep?" "Well," Chloe said. She sat on the low wooden stool near the counter, pulling her knees up to her chest and wrapping her arms around her legs. "No noise." "The building is quiet on weekends," Julian said, pouring the boiling water into a French press. The rich, earthy smell of coffee bloomed into the warm air, immediately cutting through the cold silver light of the window. "Most of the students go home or sleep in," It's just us." Chloe reached into her canvas bag, which sat on the floor beside the counter, and pulled out her phone. She turned it on. The screen lit up, its white glare reflecting off the polished wood of the kitchen counter. She had expected another wave of frantic text messages from her mother or a long, aggressive voicemail from her father. Instead, there was only a single new notification from a number she had saved under Mr. Song. Mr. Song was the owner of Song's Oriental Market, the small Asian grocery store located directly next door to Han's Prestige Cleaners on the commercial strip. He was 55, a quiet man who spent his days sitting behind a counter filled with dried squid and red pepper paste, watching Korean dramas on a small tablet. Because his shop shared a brick wall with the dry cleaners, he had known the Han family for 15 years. The text had been sent at 8:14 a.m. "Minji, your mother is in my shop right now. She is very upset. She is crying. She says the dry cleaners cannot open today because the machines have no chemical and the van is gone. Your father is sitting in his car in the alley. What is going on? Did something happen to you? Are you sick?" Chloe looked at the message. She could picture the scene perfectly. Her mother, too terrified to stand in the cold, empty dry cleaners alone, had walked next door to Mr. Song's market, her apron dirty, her hands shaking as she begged him for help. Her father, unable to face the customers who were starting to arrive to pick up their weekend laundry, was hiding in the driver's seat of his Honda Civic in the gravel alley, smoking cigarettes with the windows rolled up. Mr. Song was their final line of communication. He was the informal bridge to the local immigrant network, a man who knew every Korean family within 30 miles. By going to him, her mother had made their desperation public. Chloe ran the calculation. If she remained silent, Mr. Song would call her. He would try to mediate, using his position as an elder to gently pressure her into coming back to help her parents. He would say things like, "They are old, Minji. They sacrificed for you. You have to understand their hearts." If she let the community pressure build, the thread would tighten. She had to cut it, publicly and cleanly, so that there was no room left for negotiation. She tapped her screen, opening the reply box. "Hi, Mr. Song," she typed, her thumbs moving with a slow, deliberate precision. "I am no longer working at Han's Prestige Cleaners or managing my parents' business. I have moved out of their house and am no longer involved in their financial or legal operations. If my mother needs help with the city permits or the shop, please tell her to hire a professional commercial translation service. I cannot help them anymore. Thank you, Chloe." She read the message once, her eyes tracking the cold, clinical English words. She had used her English name, Chloe, instead of Min-ji. It was a small physical marker of the distance she had placed between herself and the girl who had spent her youth translating their shame. She hit send. The progress bar slid across the top of the screen before disappearing with a quiet, metallic swoosh. By sending this to Mr. Song, she had effectively broadcasted her departure to the entire local immigrant network. Within 2 hours, every business owner on the commercial strip would know that Jin Woo Han's daughter had walked away. The shield of family privacy her father had used to hide his financial failures and his environmental violations was gone. Chloe set her phone face down on the counter. Julian set a warm mug of coffee in front of her. He didn't ask to see the phone. He didn't ask what Mr. Song had said. He simply reached out and gently ran his fingers through her hair, smoothing a loose strand behind her ear. "The coffee is hot," Julian said. "Don't burn yourself." Chloe picked up the mug. The warmth of the ceramic seeped into her hands, solid and clean. She took a slow sip, her eyes fixed on the pale silver light that was slowly spreading across the floorboards of her new life. Behind her, 3 miles away, the gravel alley behind Hans' Prestige Cleaners was likely silent, save for the rhythmic, cold drip of the sleet melting from the gutters onto the rusted roof of her father's car, where a man sat in the dark, waiting for a voice that would never speak for him again. On Monday morning at 7:45 a.m., the air was cold enough to turn every breath into a fleeting white cloud. Chloe parked her Civic half a block away from the commercial strip, near an old iron storm drain where the street gutter was choked with damp brown leaves. The engine was off, leaving the car silent, save for the faint, cooling tick of the exhaust beneath the chassis. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the brass house key, the one with the small, cracked blue plastic cap she had used to identify it since she was 12 years old. It felt surprisingly light in her palm, a thin sliver of metal that had once granted her access to a house she no longer called home. She rolled down the window. The cold, wet air rushed in, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant asphalt. She held the key over the iron grate of the storm drain. Her fingers opened. The key fell, tumbling through the narrow gap between the rusted iron bars. A second later, a tiny, hollow plink echoed from the dark, wet concrete chamber below as the brass struck the shallow pool of rainwater. She rolled the window back up, sealing the cabin once more. She turned the key in the ignition, put the car in gear, and drove slowly toward the intersection. At 8:02 a.m., she passed the front of Hans' Prestige Cleaners. The gray County Health Department vehicle, a clean SUV with official blue and gold seals on the doors, was parked crookedly on the curb in front of the shop. 2 men in dark utility jackets and a woman carrying a heavy, clipboard-backed folder stood on the wet concrete sidewalk. A heavy, galvanized steel chain had already been threaded through the brass handles of the double-glass doors. The woman from the county was in the middle of snapping a heavy, laminated orange padlock notice directly over the keyhole, securing it with a thick, yellow plastic seal. Chloe's parents stood 3 feet away on the damp sidewalk. Her father, Jin Woo, was wearing his charcoal suit jacket over his dirty work polo, the fabric tight and awkward across his hunched shoulders. His hands were shaking as he held out a thick, white bank envelope, the envelope containing the $3,000 cash they had left in the safe. He was thrusting it toward the inspector, his face a pale, desperate gray, his mouth moving in rapid, fragmented English phrases that the inspector was politely but firmly ignoring with a series of slow shakes of her head. Beside him, Eun-ji was sitting on the low concrete curb, her face buried in her apron, her shoulders shaking with quiet, hysterical sobs. She looked incredibly small, a tiny, damp shape huddled against the cold brick of the building, completely stripped of the furious, commanding presence she had held for 22 years. Chloe's car crept forward, matching the slow Monday morning traffic. As she drew level with the shop, her father turned his head. His eyes, small and dark beneath his swollen brow, scanned the street with a frantic, wild desperation. He saw the gray Civic. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met through the double-paned glass of her passenger window. Jin Woo took a sudden, lunging step toward the curb, his arm half raising, his lips moving to call the name he had used to summon her his entire life. He believed, even now, that she would stop. He believed that if he ran to the edge of the street, the car would pull over, the door would open, and the voice that had always made the bad papers go away would speak the words that would unlock his world. Chloe's hand remained steady on the steering wheel. She did not tap the brake pedal. She did not roll down the window. She pressed the accelerator, her foot moving with a slow, deliberate pressure. The Civic's engine hummed, carrying her smoothly past the curb, past the shaking figure of her father, and past the orange notice hanging on the locked glass door. In her rearview mirror, she watched his figure shrink, growing smaller and more distant until he was nothing more than a dark, hunched shape standing alone on a wet sidewalk, swallowed by the morning fog. She looked ahead into the wide, open stretch of the avenue that led to the highway, and then to Unit 4B. The road was clean, dry, and completely silent. Some debts are not paid in currency. They are paid in the quiet, absolute withdrawal of the hand that carried them. When the weight of a family's silent choices finally collapses the bridge, the only thing left to do is let the pieces fall where they may. If this story of calculated justice and silent resolve resonated with you, consider subscribing to our channel, Crazy Karma Stories. Here, we explore the quiet, inevitable threads of destiny, the moments where the scales of life are finally, perfectly balanced, and every unspoken debt is collected. Subscribe today to stay with us for the next chapter of unspoken truths and the quiet storms of fate.